The station master didn't even look at the child when he said it. He was a thick-necked man with a gray mustache that needed trimming, and he spoke the way men speak when they've already decided something before you open your mouth. He said, "I don't run a charity house, and neither does this town." Then he picked up Nell's little carpetbag, the one with the broken latch that Marin had tied shut with a piece of twine, and set it outside the station door like it was trash he was clearing off his porch. Nell was 5 years old. She was asleep against her mother's shoulder. She didn't even wake up. And Marin Whitlock stood there in the middle of that train station in Red Willow, Nebraska, in the cold of October 1887, with her sleeping daughter heavy in her arms and nowhere left in the world to go. And she did not cry. She wanted to. Lord, she wanted to. But she had learned by then that crying didn't move men like that station master. Nothing moved men like that station master. So she lifted her chin, picked up her bag with the hand that wasn't holding Nell, and she walked out that door, into wind that nearly took her off her feet. If its windows were dark, if you've ever been in a place where you had nothing left to give and nobody left to call, if you've ever been so tired that tired stops feeling like tiredness and starts feeling like something heavier, something that settles in your bones, then you already understand something about Marin Whitlock before she says a single word. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that moves you, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. And while you're watching with him, drop a comment and tell me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Red Willow. Let's go back to that wind. Marin had not planned on Red Willow. She had not planned on most things if she was honest. She had not planned on becoming a widow at 26, or on the landlord coming 3 weeks after her husband Thomas's funerals to inform her that the rent had been in Thomas's name and she had 2 weeks to vacate. She had not planned on her sister in Omaha shutting the door on her face with a gentle but absolute "I have 4 of my own, Marin. I cannot," or on the boarding house in Lincoln that turned her away because they didn't house children under school age. She had not planned on spending 9 months drifting from one temporary arrangement to the next. Always one cold night away from sleeping outside. Most of its windows were dark, always one rejection away from the edge of something she couldn't name, but could feel pressing against her like a hand on the back of her neck. She had not planned on arriving at the end of the westbound line in Red Willow with 40 bag containing 2 dresses, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a pair of Thomas's work gloves she still couldn't explain keeping, a tin of tooth powder, and Nell. Always Nell. Nell, who had gone quiet in the way children go quiet when they sense the adults around them are frightened. Nell, who hadn't asked for anything in 2 days. Not food, not stories, not the little cloth rabbit she'd left behind in Lincoln. Nell, who was 5 years old and had already learned to make herself small. That was the thing that cut Marin deepest. Not her own hunger, not her own exhaustion. It was watching her daughter learn to take up less space. The station at Red Willow was nothing impressive. A single-room building with a wood stove that the station master kept too hot for himself, and not hot enough for anyone waiting. There were 2 other people on the bench when Marin came in from the train. A young cowboy with mud on his boots who fell asleep within 5 minutes of sitting down, and an older woman in a black coat who looked at Marin once, looked at Nell, and then looked away in the particular way of someone who has decided not to get involved. Marin had not asked anyone for anything. She had not done anything except sit on the bench with Nell draped across her lap, trying to figure out what came next. She had heard there was domestic work in these smaller frontier towns. She had heard the ranchers here sometimes needed women who could cook and manage a household, and that a few of them didn't care whether you came with references or recommendations, only whether you could do the work. She was going to find one of those ranchers. In the morning, when there was light to see by, and the wind had died down, and she could leave Nell somewhere warm while she asked around. That had been the plan. Then the station master had looked up from his desk and said, "Station closes at 7, everybody out." And Marin had said careful, measured, because she had learned that desperation in a woman's voice made certain men dig their heels in. "Sir, my daughter is asleep. It's near freezing outside. Is there somewhere in town?" I said, "Everybody out. A church, maybe," or he had already picked up the bag. Outside, the wind came at her from the north, with a kind of personal meanness, the kind that finds the gaps in your coat. Nell stirred when the cold hit her, and burrowed deeper into Marin's shoulder without fully waking, and Marin stood on the wooden platform for a moment and simply looked at the town of Red Willow, a main street, maybe 12 buildings on each side, one saloon, lights on, laughter carrying through the wall, a general store that was locked and dark, a church at the far end with no lamp in the window, 3 horses hitched outside the saloon, and one outside a building she couldn't identify in the dark. 43 cents. She did the arithmetic she'd already done 100 times. It didn't come out differently. There was no boarding house she could see, and even if there was, the cheapest room she'd found in any town like this was 30 cents, and that left her 13 cents in the morning with a daughter to feed, and no guarantee of work. She shifted Nell's weight to her other arm and picked up the carpetbag and started walking. She told herself she was walking toward the church. She told herself that even locked churches had porches, and a porch was wind cover, which was something. She did not let herself think further ahead than that, because thinking further ahead than the next immediate problem was a luxury she could not currently afford. She had gotten about 30 feet when she noticed the man. He was standing outside the building she hadn't been able to identify, turned out to a feed store closed for the night, and he was reading something by the light that spilled from the saloon across the street. A tall man, broad through the shoulders with a hat pulled low and a coat that had seen enough winters to stop being new. He wasn't watching her. He was genuinely reading. She almost walked past him. She had made a rule for herself, somewhere in the last 9 months of asking and being refused. The rule was, don't ask men alone after dark. Not because all men were dangerous, but because the odds were bad and she was carrying Nell and she couldn't afford bad odds. She had kept that rule every time she'd been tempted to break it. She broke it. She stopped walking and she turned and she said, "Excuse me." He looked up. His face was unreadable in the low light. She couldn't have told you if he was annoyed or curious, or neither. He said, "Ma'am," in a voice that was quiet and level, the kind of voice that didn't have extra in it. Marin shifted Nell's weight again and said, "I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for food. I am asking," and here she paused because her voice was threatening to do something she wouldn't allow it to do. "I am asking if you know of anywhere in this town where a woman and her childs can sleep tonight. Just tonight. Something that doesn't cost more than 15 cents, because that is what I have." She had 43 cents. She didn't know why she said 15. Maybe because it left her something. Maybe because it felt more honest than the full number. Maybe because she was too tired to calculate properly. And 15 was the first number that came out. The man looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Nell. Then he looked back at Marin, and she watched him in that half second the way she'd learned to watch strangers, reading for the thing behind the face, the pity that condescends, the interest that unnerves, the dismiss that stings. What she saw was none of those things. He said, "How old is she?" Marin said 5. He said, "When did she last eat?" Marin said, "This afternoon." It had been a biscuit she'd bought at a train stop for a nickel, split between them, and she'd given Nell the larger half and pretended she wasn't hungry. He didn't call her out on that, though something in his suggested he might have if she were a different kind of person, and this were a different kind of conversation. He just said, "I've got a ranch about 4 miles out. I've got a cottage on the property that nobody's using right now. Wood stove that works. There's a cook fire if you know how to use it." He paused. "I've got a cook who can put together something cold from what's left from supper." Marin looked at him. She was very good at looking at people now. It was a skill she'd developed out of necessity, the way you develop all the skills that desperation teaches you. She said, "What do you want for it?" He almost smiled. Almost. Just the edge of something that might have been a smile in better lighting. He said, "I want someone who can cook and someone who can keep accounts. My current situation on both of those is," he considered his words, "not working out the way I'd like." "I can do both of those things," Marin said, which was true. She had kept the books for Thomas's small freight business, and she had been cooking for herself and Nell and a rotating cast of boarding house situations since she was 16 years old. "Then it's not charity," he said. "It's a work arrangement. You start in the morning if the work suits you. Tonight is," another pause, "tonight is just the child in from the cold." There it was. Right there. Tonight is just getting the child in from the cold. No terms. No conditions attached to the shelter itself. No suggestion of what she might owe him for it. Just a plain statement of the thing that needed doing right now. She said, "My name is Maren Whitlock." He said, "Bram Hollister." She said, "I need to know one thing before I get in any wagon with you." He said, "All right. If I don't like the arrangement in the morning," she said, "I need to know I can leave." He said, "You can leave. You can leave tonight if you want, once the child's warm." He said it the way someone says a thing that seems obvious to them. "I'm not in the business of keeping people who don't want to stay." Maren looked at him for one more long moment. The wind pushed at her back like it was trying to help. Nell shifted against her shoulder and made a small sound, not quite a word, and then went still again. "All right," Maren said. "I'll take the work." The wagon was cold, but there were blankets in the back that had the smell of hay and horses and something that was almost warmth, and Maren wrapped Nell in two of them and held her close and felt not safe. Exactly. Safety was something she'd learned not to assume, but something adjacent to safe, something in the neighborhood of it. Bram Hollister drove and didn't say much, and she was grateful for that. Men who talked a lot made her nervous now. Men who filled silence with the sound of themselves, explaining and justifying and narrating. Those men, she had learned, were usually doing something with their words that they weren't advertising with their words. This man drove and watched the road and let the silence be what it was. Once, about a mile out, he said, "There's a lamp lit in the cottage. My foreman's wife put it on. She knew I might be bringing someone back." Maren said, "You planned for this?" He said, "Not exactly. But Doris plans for things I don't think to plan for. She's been doing it for 11 years, so I stopped trying to stay ahead of her." Something about that almost made Maren want to smile. Almost. She said, Will she be there tonight?" He said, "She lives in the main house. The cottage is yours. She'll knock in the morning." Maren said, "I don't need waiting on." He said, "I didn't imagine you did." Flat. No judgment. Just a statement that matched what she'd told him about herself. Nell woke up when the wagon stopped, blinking and confused, and looked at the small dark cottage with the warm yellow square of light in one window, and said, "Mama, are we home?" And that was the word that did it. That was the one Maren couldn't block. Home. Out of a 5-year-old's mouth, innocent as breathing, the most complicated word in the English language in that particular moment. Maren held it together. She held it together the way she'd held it together for 9 months, through all of it, because Nell needed her steady, and Nell needed her clear. And the moment Maren fell apart was the moment everything fell apart. But something cracked inside her, somewhere deep down, at that single word from her daughter. She said, "For tonight, baby. Tonight we're home." The cottage was small. A main room with a table and 2 chairs. A wood stove that someone had already lit, the fire low but real, pushing warmth into the space. A bed along one wall, made up with a quilt that looked like someone's grandmother had stitched it in a long Ago winter. A second, smaller cot pushed against the other wall for Nell, Maren realized. Someone had thought about Nell. Someone had put a cot in here for a child they hadn't met. Doris, presumably, the foreman's wife who planned for things. There was food on the table. Cold biscuits, a wedge of hard cheese, a jar of something that turned out to be apple butter, and a small covered pot that, when Maren lifted the lid, contained bean soup that was still warm. Nell ate 2 biscuits with apple butter and half a bowl of soup and fell back asleep before Maren had finished the other half of the soup herself. And then Maren sat in one of the chairs in the warm room and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like months. She was not home. She knew that. She was in a stranger's cottage on a stranger's ranch in a town she'd never heard of 3 weeks ago, and tomorrow was still full of unknowns, and nothing was settled or safe or guaranteed. But Nell was warm, and Nell had eaten, and Nell was sleeping on a real cot with a real quilt, not across her mother's lap on a wooden train bench. It was enough for tonight. It had to be enough for tonight. Maren sat in that chair until the fire burned lower, and she did not let herself think about Thomas, and she did not let herself think about Omaha or Lincoln or any of the places that hadn't worked. She thought only about morning, about what she would cook, because she already knew she could cook, about what questions she would need answered, before she decided whether this arrangement was real or whether it was one of the situations that looked like solid ground and turned out to be something else. She was good at cooking. She was good at keeping books. She had more than that to offer. She knew it, and she needed whoever ran this ranch to know it quickly. She would make sure Bram Hollister understood, come morning, that the woman he'd brought in from the cold was not going to be a burden to him. She'd had enough of being a woman people needed to carry. Tomorrow she would show him what she actually was. She put more wood on the fire. She checked Nell one more time. Sound asleep, rabbit breath, the little furrow between her brows finally smoothed out. Then she pulled the second quilt from the bed over herself in the chair, because the bed was for Nell, and that was that. She was asleep in under 3 minutes. Outside, the prairie wind kept on. It didn't care about Maren Whitlock, or what she was or wasn't. It didn't care about any of them out here on the edge of Nebraska. It just kept blowing, the way it had blown long before any of them arrived, and would blow long after. But inside the cottage, the fire held, and that for one night was everything. She was up before the fire had a chance to go cold. That was not an accident. Maren had made a decision somewhere in the thin hours before dawn. Not a dramatic decision, not the kind that announces itself with feeling, just a quiet and absolute one, the kind that forms in the place below thought. She would not let anyone on this ranch see her sleeping past first light. She would not give anyone a single hour of the morning that she hadn't already filled with something useful. She had come here with almost nothing, and almost nothing was exactly what she intended to cost them while she figured out whether this place was real. She stoked the fire and put on the one dress she hadn't slept in. She splashed water from the basin on her face and did her hair without looking at the small square of mirrors looking at above the basin. She already knew what looking at it would tell her. She didn't have time for that conversation with herself. She checked Nell still asleep, one arm thrown over her head the way she always slept, finally looking like a child instead of a small person braced for something. Maren let her sleep. Then she picked up her coat and went to find the kitchen. The main house was bigger than she'd been able to see in the dark. A two-story windows were dark, a two-story structure with a wide front porch and a kitchen addition built onto the back that looked like it had been added in a hurry and never quite caught up to the rest of the building. The back door was unlocked. Ranches in 1887 didn't go in much for locked kitchen doors, and she pushed it open and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking inventory. Cast iron stove, good size with a warming shelf above. Dry goods in a line of canisters that someone had labeled in a handwriting that slanted hard to the right. A work table down the center, scarred from years of use. Pots hanging from iron hooks overhead. A flour barrel in the corner that was about 2/3 full. Eggs in a basket near the window, she counted 14. Salt pork hanging from a hook near the door. Onions braided and hung beside it. She started a fire in the stove. She was 3 biscuits into the first batch when she heard footsteps on the back porch. Too heavy to be a child, too quick to be an old man, and the door opened and a woman came in carrying a bucket and stopped dead when she saw Maren at the work table. The woman was somewhere in her mid-40s, solid through the middle, with gray streaking into her dark hair and flour already on her apron from what looked like an earlier start to the morning. She had the kind of face that had once been pretty and had traded pretty for something more durable without appearing to miss it much. She said, "Lord have mercy, you're already in here." Maren said, "I hope that's all right. I needed something to do with my hands." The woman set her bucket down and looked at the stove, at the biscuits taking shape, at the coffee. Maren had just started, without asking anyone's permission. Then she said, "I'm Doris Hatch. My husband Calvin runs the crew." Maren Whitlock. "I know." Doris pulled out a chair and sat down and watched Maren work with an expression that was not quite suspicious and not quite approving, but somewhere in between, like a woman reserving judgment until she has more information. "Bram told Calvin you might be helping with the cooking for a while. If the arrangement works out," Maren said. "I haven't agreed to anything permanent yet." Doris blinked at that. It was clear she hadn't expected the woman from the train station to talk like that. Most women in Maren's situation, and Doris had seen a few, over the years came in soft and grateful, nodding at whatever was offered. This one was standing at someone else's stove at 5 a.m. making biscuits and saying, "I haven't agreed to anything permanent yet," like she was the one with options. "Fair enough," Doris said after a moment. Maren said, "Who usually cooks?" "Me, mostly. And a boy named Edgar who burns things." She paused. "He burned a very expensive ham 3 weeks ago, and Bram has not fully recovered from it." Maren almost smiled. She pulled the first biscuits from the oven. "How many men are you feeding?" 9, counting Bram. Sometimes 12 if the seasonal hands are here. What time do they come in? 6. Sometimes 6:15 if someone had too good a time in town. Marin looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was 10 minutes past 5. She said, "Is there a side of salt pork I can use? Or does it need to be spoken for first?" Doris stood up. "I'll get the accounts book." Marin cooked for 9 men that first morning, and none of them said much, which she took as a positive sign. Stews were dark. Men who ate her food in silence were usually men eating it fast because they didn't want it to end, which was different from the silence of food that wasn't worth commenting on. She watched them from the corner of her eye while she refilled the coffee pot. Watching was something she did automatically now, reading rooms the way some people read newspapers. Bram Hollister came in last. He sat at the head of the table and put his hat on the hook and poured his own coffee before she could get to him. And then he looked at the plate she set down in front of him with the careful expression of a man who has been disappointed by breakfast before and has learned not to assume. He took one bite of the biscuit. He said nothing. But he ate 3 of them, which Marin counted. After the crew had cleared out, when it was just him and the dregs of the coffee and the wreck of a table that 9 working men leave behind, he said, "Where did you learn to cook like that?" "My mother," Marin said, stacking plates. "And then necessity." He said, "Are you going to stay?" She set the plates down. She'd been thinking about that since the first biscuit. She'd been thinking about the cottage, about the cot Doris had put in for Nell, about the food on the table and the warm fire, and all of it thinking about how easy it would be to let herself feel like it was solid ground before she'd checked what was under it. She said, "I'd like to see the accounts first." He looked at her. "You said you needed someone for accounts," she said. "I'd like to see what's there before I commit to cleaning it up." He got up and came back 3 minutes later with a ledger that he set on the cleared end of the table and didn't open. He said, "My last man doing the books quit in June. Everything from June onward I've been doing myself." Marin opened the ledger. She turned to June and started reading forward. She didn't say anything for almost 10 minutes, which she could feel him bearing with some difficulty. He was not. She had already gathered, a man who liked to wait. Finally she said, "You've been paying for winter feed storage in 2 places." He said, "I use the granary north of." "You've been paying the Delacroix storage yard off the East Road since March, in addition to the granary." Silence. "I don't know who set this up," she said carefully, "but you've been paying for 60 cubic yards of storage space at the Delacroix yard every month since March for..." She did the math. "Storage you're not using. I don't see a single delivery receipt here tied to that location." More silence. A different quality of silence. He said, "Delacroix is my brother-in-law." Marin closed the ledger. She looked at him. She said nothing, because that was the kind of thing that a woman in her position needed to let a man find his own way around. Bram's jaw was doing something tight and controlled. He said, "How much?" She reopened the ledger. 7 months at the contracted rate. Call it $64. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he said, "What else?" She turned more pages. "Your flour contracts are running higher than market. About 12%. Whoever negotiated the last renewal, that was Delacroix too." She said, "All right." She closed the ledger again. "I can go through the whole thing. It'll take me most of today. But I want to be clear about something." He looked at her. "What I find in here is what I find," she said. "I'll tell you all of it. But this isn't me making a case against anyone. I don't know this family, and I don't know what arrangements exist between you and your brother-in-law or why. I'm just going to tell you what the numbers say." Bram looked at her for a long moment. He had steady gray eyes that had probably unnerved a lot of people over the years, and had, she suspected, never once unnerved the man using them. He said, "That's fair." She said, "I'll stay. For now. We can talk wages at the end of the week when you've seen what I can do." He said, "I already know what you can do with biscuits." She said, "Biscuits and accounts are different skills." He said, "I noticed you did both before 6 in the morning." She picked up the ledger and the accounts log and carried them to the kitchen table where there was better light. And that was that. Nell woke up at 7:30 and came to the main house in her coat and her boots and one of her braids already half undone, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Doris Hatch with enormous eyes. Doris looked at Nell. Nell looked at Doris. Doris said, "There's a biscuit left." Nell said, "My mama makes good biscuits." Doris said, "She makes excellent biscuits. Do you want butter on yours?" Nell considered this with the gravity of someone making an important decision. Yes, please. And that was how Nell started spending her mornings in the kitchen with Doris, learning where everything was and whether she was allowed to touch it and what the difference was between the flour barrel and the cornmeal barrel, which she had already confused twice by the end of the first week. Marin watched this from a careful distance. She was glad for it. Doris was sharp but kind in the practical, unsentimental way of frontier women who had raised children and buried at least one, whose affection came in the form of extra biscuits and firm instruction rather than soft words. Nell needed someone besides her mother. Marin knew that. She also knew that she needed to be careful about letting her daughter grow attached to a situation that might not so sight. And she held that worry the way she held most of her worries, tightly and quietly and away from Nell's sight. But the days went on, and the situation lasted. By the end of the first week, Marin had found 11 discrepancies in the ranch's accounts. 4 of them were simple errors, transposed numbers, missed entries. The kind of thing that happens when the man doing the books was better with cattle than with columns. The other 7 were more interesting. She presented them to Bram. Tuesday, Bram on a Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table, with Nell outside feeding the chickens under the supervision of a ranch hand named Pete, who was 17 and therefore only slightly better suited to the task than Nell was. She laid out the numbers plainly. She didn't dramatize. She didn't editorialize. She had been very deliberate about that because she understood that what she was telling him involved family and money in combination, which was the exact combination most likely to make people defensive, and a defensive Bram Hollister was not something she needed in her first week. He looked at the numbers for a long time. He said, I trusted him. She said, I know. He said, we were neighbors before he married my sister. I've known him since he was 22 years old. She said, I know. She waited. Do you want me to put together a full accounting? Everything back to January? He said, yes. He said it like a door closing. Not angry at her, she could see that clearly. But something in him had gone very quiet and flat, the way ground goes flat right before weather. She said, Bram. It was the first time she'd used his name without a sir before it, and it surprised her slightly. I'm sorry. He looked up. I know that's not... She chose her words carefully. I know finding out that someone took advantage of you doesn't feel like a problem getting solved. It feels like something else. He looked at her for a moment, and whatever he was going to say, he decided against him. And instead he just said, how long will the full accounting take? 3 days if I work straight. Take 4, he said, and use the desk in the study. The light's better in there. She used the desk in the study. She worked 4 days, and the picture that emerged from those 4 days was precise and damning, and Marin wrote it up in 2 pages of clear handwriting that said exactly what the numbers said without using a word like theft or dishonest, because she had not been hired to make those determinations, and it was not her place to make them. She handed those 2 pages to Bram on a Tuesday morning and went back to the kitchen. She didn't hear anything about Delacroix for 2 weeks. She didn't ask. What she heard instead, about 10 days after she handed over those pages, was Bram and Calvin Hatch talking in low voices in the hallway outside the study, and then the sound of a wagon going out in the early morning, and then silence. Calvin came back alone. Bram didn't come back until supper. He was quiet at the table. The men ate and talked among themselves, careful the way working men are careful around an employer who's in a mood, keeping the conversation to weather and cattle and small inconsequential things. Marin refilled coffee and said nothing. After, when the table was cleared, Bram came into the kitchen and poured himself a second cup of coffee he didn't drink and stood by the window for a moment. He said, the arrangement with Delacroix is ended. She said, all right, he said. I renegotiated the flour contracts. She said, good. He said, I owe you a month's wages. I'd like to discuss making this arrangement more formal. A proper wage, recorded for the cooking and the accounts work. He paused. If you want to continue. She turned from the pot she was cleaning. She said, I want to continue. He said, you didn't even ask how much. She said, I was going to. Something crossed his face. The edge of that almost smile she'd seen the night at the train station. He said the number. It was more than she'd expected. Not extravagantly more, but meaningfully more. The kind of wage that left room to start saving. She said, that's fair. He said, it's what the work is worth. She said, then we agree. He went back out. She finished cleaning the pot. And in the quiet of the kitchen, For the first time in a very long time, she let herself think, not plan, just think about what might look like, to not be one bad situation away from the edge of everything. It felt dangerous, thinking like that. She made herself stop and went to check on Nell. The men were a problem she hadn't anticipated. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But there were 3 who had made up their minds about Marin within the first 48 hours, and were not inclined to revise that opinion on the basis of new information. The one who showed it most plainly was a hand named Roy Garrett 40-something, weathered, with the particular resentment of a man who has been doing things one way for a long time and reads any change as a personal criticism. Roy had been at Hollister Ridge longer than most of the others, and he carried that seniority like a title, dropping references to before your time and the way things work here into conversations, the way some men drop the names of important people they'd once met. His complaint about Marin was not delivered directly to Marin. It was delivered to Calvin, who delivered it to Doris, who told Marin while they were putting up preserves on a Wednesday afternoon. Roy says Bram's letting a charity case run the place, Doris said, not looking up from the jar she was sealing. Says it's setting a bad example. Says a penniless woman who came in off the train shouldn't be anywhere near the accounts. Marin kept cutting. She said, what does Calvin think? Calvin thinks Roy's been sore since Bram gave his storage job to Pete's older brother, and this is Roy looking for a different thing to be sore about. Marin said, he's not entirely wrong about one thing. Doris looked up. I did come in off the train with almost nothing, Marin said. That's not a secret. If he wants to think that makes me untrustworthy, that's his right. She set down the knife. What I won't do is argue with him about it. What I will do is keep doing the work. Doris said, that's the right answer, Marin said. I know. I just wish the right answer were more satisfying. Doris laughed. Marin hadn't heard Doris laugh yet. It was bigger than expected, and it was good. Honey, she said. The right answer is almost never satisfying. It's just right. Roy wasn't alone in his skepticism. 2 of the neighboring ranchers, who came through Hollister Ridge over the following weeks, one for a cattle negotiation and one to return a borrowed piece of equipment, took their own particular entry. Marin's presence in a way that made her skin prickle. The first one, a heavy-set man named Aldous Greer, addressed all his remarks to Bram even when the subject of those remarks was something Marin had done. He said things like, I hear you've got someone new managing your books, and I hope that's working out for you. And each time he said you in that careful way, Marin felt herself being made peripheral, being rearranged from a person into a situation that existed for Bram's benefit rather than her own. She didn't say anything to Greer. She served coffee and listened and noted, and she stored what she's observed the way she stored everything now carefully, in the part of her mind that wasn't for feeling but for knowing. The second one was worse. A younger man named Webb Farley, whose ranch was 2 miles east, and who had, according to Doris, recently hired and then fired 2 different housekeepers under circumstances that Doris described as not good ones. Farley came ostensibly to return a fence post driver he'd borrowed in July, and he managed in the course of a 20-minute conversation to ask Marin where she'd come from, whether she had family nearby, and whether she'd considered that Red Willow had more to offer a woman of her. And here he'd used the word capabilities. And the way he'd said it had made the word mean, something it wasn't supposed to mean. Marin's had said, I'm settled here for the foreseeable future, Mr. Farley. He had said, well, that's Bram's good fortune. She had said, it's mine, actually. He'd smiled at that. Not a kind smile. The kind that was correcting you, even while it appeared agreeable. He said, that's a confident thing to say. She said, it is. And she took the coffee cup he'd set down and went back inside. She heard him say something to Bram outside that she couldn't make out through the door, but she heard Bram's response, short, level, unrevealing. Whatever Farley had suggested, whatever comment or implication he'd walked out here with, Bram had not agreed with it. She could tell that much from the tone. She didn't ask about it. Bram didn't volunteer it, but she thought about it. Winter came in hard that year. The first real snow arrived in late November, and the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that makes the walls of a building creak and pop like something alive is pressing on them from outside. The ranch hands spent long days in brutal conditions, checking on cattle, breaking ice from the water troughs, hauling feed to the animals that couldn't be brought in closer. Marin's days got longer too. Breakfasts had to be bigger and hotter, because men doing that work in that cold needed more fuel. She started making a midday meal as well, something hot she could send out with Pete when he rode the ridge, because she had noticed that the men coming in for supper were sometimes so cold their hands didn't work right, and she'd worked out that if they had something warm in the afternoon, they came back in better condition. Nobody asked her to do this. She just started doing it. Bram noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly. But one evening he came in from a long day that had clearly been brutal. His face was raw from the wind, and he had that particular careful way of moving that meant everything hurt, and he sat down at the table and looked at the bowl of beef and potato. Soup she put in front of him, and then he looked up at her, and he said, "The afternoon provisions." "That was you," she said. It made sense. He said, "It's added to your workload considerably." She said, "When winter's hard, they need more food. That's just what's true." He looked at her for a moment in that particular way he had, the one where she could feel him processing something and choosing what to say about it out of a longer private thought. He said, "I'm increasing your wage starting this month." She said, "You don't have to." He said, "I'm not in the habit of letting people work without fair compensation." He said it evenly, without weight, but she felt the weight of it anyway, because she knew what he was really saying. He was saying, "You are not working for charity here. You never were." She said, "Thank you." He said, "It's what the work is worth." It was what he'd said before. She realized she was starting to learn the pattern of him. The things he said when he meant something, he didn't have a different way to say. It's what the work is worth. Meaning you are worth something. Meaning don't argue with me about this. She didn't argue. Nell had a bad week in December. It started as a cold. The ordinary kind, stuffy nose and crankiness, and a mild fever that Moran managed with wet cloths and warm broth, and the firm application of rest, which Nell resisted with the full power of a 5-year-old who has recently discovered that the ranch contains chickens, a 3-legged barn cat named Persistence, and a ranch hand named Pete who would do almost anything she asked if she asked it in the right voice. But the cold got worse before it got better. The fever spiked on a Thursday night, and Marin sat up with Nell through all of it, changing cloths, feeding her sips of water, talking to her when she was awake enough to be talked to, and watching her chest rise and fall when she wasn't. It was the longest night Marin could remember, including the night Thomas had died. At least that night, she'd known what the outcome was going to be. This night she didn't know, and not knowing was a different kind of terrible. Doris came at 4 in the morning. Nobody had sent for her. She had simply woken up and felt that she should come, the way women who have raised children develop an instinct for when another woman is in trouble with one. She came in quietly, looked at Nell, looked at Marin, and said, "Go sleep for 2 hours." Marin said, "I can't, I'll stay right here," Doris said. "I will not move from this chair. You sleep 2 hours, and then you come back, and you'll be steadier." Marin looked at her daughter. She looked at Doris. She lay down on the small cot and was asleep in minutes because she was that kind of exhausted, and 2 hours later, Doris woke her, and the fever had broken, and Nell was sleeping the quiet sleep of a child on the other side of something. Marin sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and breathed. Doris sat beside her and didn't say anything, which was the correct thing. After a long while, Marin said, "She's all I have." Doris said, "I know." Marin said, "I can't," and stopped. There were things she couldn't finish saying, and she knew that, and she didn't try to force them. Doris said, "She's past it." Children spike like that. "It's terrifying every time, but she's past it now." Marin nodded. She wiped her face on her sleeve, which was not dignified, but she was past caring about dignified at 4:30 in the morning. She said, "Thank you for coming." Doris said, "That's what neighbors do." It was a small word, neighbors, and Doris had said it simply, without emphasis. But Marin felt it land somewhere it hadn't been expected and stay there. Neighbors, not charity, not someone managing a difficult situation. Neighbors. Bram heard about the night with Nell's fever from Calvin, who heard about it from Doris. And he appeared at the cottage door the following evening with a bundle of things that turned out to contain a bottle of willow bark tincture, a jar of honey from someone in town, and 2 books with pictures that he said the mercantile owner had suggested might suit a child of Nell's age. He stood at the door and held out the bundle and said, "I heard she had a rough few days." Marin said, "She's better. She ate this morning." He said, "Good." He held out the bundle. She took it. She looked at it. She said, "This wasn't necessary." He said, "Probably not." He wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but he had the look of a man who had made a decision and was standing by it and not particularly interested in relitigating it. "She's a good kid," Marin said. "She is," he said. "She told Pete that when she grows up, she wants to raise chickens and be a lawyer." Marin said, "She told me she wants to be a chicken." A pause. Then Bram Hollister did something she hadn't seen him do before. He laughed. Not the almost smile, not the quiet version of humor he usually let out. An actual laugh, low and brief and real. It changed his face. It made him look younger, and considerably less, like someone permanently braced against something. She found she was smiling too, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to be smiling at the door of a borrowed cottage in Nebraska in December, over a conversation about her daughter's professional aspirations, and yet here she was. He said, "Good night, Marin." She said, "Good night." She paused. "Thank you. For the books." He said, "She'll probably like the chickens better," and walked back toward the main house. She stood in the doorway in the cold and watched him go, and thought nothing particular, or tried not to. The night was very still. The snow on the ground caught what little light there was and threw it back up at the sky, and the prairie was the kind of quiet that is almost not quiet, but is the sound of everything that doesn't make noise. She went inside and showed Nell the books. Most of its windows were dark. Looked at the pictures for 20 minutes and then fell asleep with one of them open on her chest, and Marin sat in the chair by the wood stove and looked at her daughter sleeping and thought, "We are still here. We are still here and we are warm, and my daughter is alive and we are still here." It was enough. For now, it had to be enough. But something had shifted inside her, something she couldn't have named exactly and was not ready to examine. Something that's had to do with the laugh at the cottage door, and the books wrapped in brown paper, and a word Doris had used that had settled somewhere and was staying. Marin was not a woman who let herself want things before she was sure she could have them. But she was beginning, very carefully, very quietly, not to be afraid of staying. Spring came to Hollister Ridge the way spring usually came to that part of Nebraska. Not gently, not with any of the soft, gradual warming that people who hadn't lived through a plains winter sometimes imagined. It came in arguments. A warm week followed by a late frost that killed 2 of the kitchen garden's early shoots. A thaw that turned the ranch road to mud so thick Pete's horse lost a shoe in it and had to be walked back. Then, finally, genuine warmth that arrived one Tuesday morning and didn't leave, and the whole ranch seemed to exhale something it had been holding since November. Nell came out of winter different than she'd gone into it. The child who had come off that train in October silent, watchful, making herself small in the practiced way of a child who had learned that smallness was a form of safety. That child was not entirely gone, but she was retreating. In her place was a 6-year-old who had strong opinions about which chickens were friendly and which ones were liars, who had taught herself to read 3 letters of the alphabet from the books Bram had brought in December and now demanded that someone teach her the rest of them, and who had recently informed Calvin Hatch at breakfast that he was chewing too loud. Calvin had looked at her over his coffee cup and said, "Is that right?" Nell had said, "Mama says it's not polite." Marin had been at the stove with her back to the table, and she had very carefully not turned around. Calvin had chewed more quietly after that. The men had mostly come around to Nell, the way working men come around to children who don't bother them too much, and occasionally say things that are genuinely funny. Not with overt affection, but with a tolerance that had, over the winter months, quietly become something closer to fondness. Even Roy Garrett, who maintained his general suspicion of Marin with the dedication of a man who has staked something on being right, was observed one afternoon showing Nell how to properly coil a rope. He did it with the patient exactness of someone cares about doing things correctly. And when she got it wrong 3 times in a row, he showed her again without any visible irritation, which was more patience than he showed most of the actual ranch hands. Marin noticed that too. She noticed everything, still. It had not become less necessary. What had changed was what she did with what she noticed. In October, she'd been cataloging threats, keeping inventory of everything that might go wrong, everyone who might turn on them, every situation that might collapse. She'd been living 3 steps ahead of disaster, because disaster had been 3 steps behind her for the better part of a year. Now she was beginning slowly, with the particular caution of someone who has been burned by optimism before, to notice things that were simply good. A meal that came out right. Nell laughing at something, Pete said. The accounts book balanced clean at the end of the month. Doris sitting across from her at the kitchen table after supper, with a cup of tea going cold between her hands, talking about nothing important, just talking. She was beginning to notice that she had stopped waking up at 3 in the morning with her heart going. Not every night, but most nights. That was not nothing. It was in April that the trouble with Roy Garrett moved from background noise to something she couldn't continue to ignore. It started, as most things that blow up start, with something small. Marin had reorganized the supply ordering system. Nothing dramatic. Just a different sequence for placing winter feed orders that she'd worked out over the course of the cold months, designed to lock in better prices by committing earlier in the season. She'd presented it to Bram, he'd agreed with her reasoning, and he'd told Calvin to implement it. Calvin told the crew. Roy came to find her. He came to the kitchen, which was her territory, in a way that the corrals and the barn were not, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Not politely, but in the way of a man who has been told often enough that you remove your hat indoors that he does it without thinking. And he said, "So I hear you changed the feed ordering." Marin was writing out a grocery list for the next supply run. She said Bram approved it. "I know he did," Roy said. "I'm asking you." She looked up. He was 62 years old, she estimated, and had the permanently squinted look of someone who had spent most of his life looking into the sun. He was not a mean man, she'd revised that early opinion. He was a man who had been in one place long enough to believe he understood it completely, and that belief was his most fragile thing. She said, "You can ask. What do you want to know?" He said, "I want to know why a woman who's been here 5 months is changing how this ranch does business," she said, "because the previous system was costing Bram money. Not a little money. I can show you the figures if you want." He said, "I don't need figures." She said, "Then what do you need?" That stopped him. He hadn't been expecting her to ask it like that plainly, without defensiveness, without the apology or backpedaling that a woman in her position might have been expected to offer. He stood in the doorway and chewed on something, and then said, "I need to know that somebody around here is still doing things the way they've always been done." Marin set down her pencil. She said, "Roy," first time she'd used his name directly. "The way things were being done was costing Bram $64 in storage fees he wasn't getting anything for. And that was just what I found in the first 4 days." He said that was Delacroix. "That wasn't the way things were being done. That was Delacroix." "Okay," she said. "You're right about that. That's fair." She meant it, which surprised him enough that he shifted his weight slightly. But the flour contracts were separate from Delacroix, and the feed ordering. They were established a long time ago, and nobody had looked at them recently. He was quiet. She said, "I'm not trying to change everything. I'm trying to fix what's broken and leave what's working alone. I know I haven't been here long. I know you have." So, he said, 11 years. "I know. And there's a lot you know about this place that I don't, and probably won't for a long time." She picked up her pencil again. "If you see me about to break something that works, I'd want you to tell me." He stood there for another moment. He didn't say anything else. He put his hat back on and left. He did not apologize, and she didn't expect him to. But the next week, when the spring supply order went out under the new system, he filled it out and handed it to Calvin without comment. And that was, for Roy Garrett, essentially a written declaration of peace. The thing about Hollister Ridge that Marin had not fully understood in winter was how much the ranch existed in relationship to the surrounding valley. She had understood it was a cattle operation. She'd understood that from the first morning when Bram had described it. What she hadn't understood was the degree to which, in a place this remote and this exposed, the ranches around it were not simply neighbors, but a kind of loose and sometimes fractious web of mutual dependence. Equipment borrowed and returned. Labor traded during branding season. Families sharing the doctor's 3-day visits and the circuit preacher's once-monthly appearance. Seeds exchanged in spring and surplus sold or traded in fall. She learned this primarily through Doris, who was the ranch's connective tissue in ways that Calvin probably didn't fully appreciate, and secondarily, through just being the person who answered the door when people came to it. She also learned it through Aldous Greer. Greer had come through twice more since winter aunts in February for a cattle negotiation with Bram, and once in March for a conversation about the spring water rights situation that she gathered was an annual occurrence, and each time he had been perfectly pleasant and perfectly deliberate in the way he managed to discuss Marin without discussing her directly. He was the kind of man who moved information around a community the way other men moved money carefully for effect, and not always toward the benefit of the people the information was about. What Marin heard through Doris was that Greer had told at least 2 people in town that Bram had taken in a charity case who had gotten her claws into the ranch accounts and was running things she had no business running. Doris told her this on a Tuesday afternoon with the directness Marin had come to expect from her. No softening, no apology for the message, just the message. Marin said, "What did you say?" Doris said, "I said that Bram Hollister was the last man in this valley who needed someone else running his ranch, and that if he wanted Marin Whitlock doing the accounts, it was because the accounts had needed doing and she'd done them." Marin said, "That's a good answer." Doris said, "I thought so." She paused. "People are going to talk, Marin. That's what people in small places do when something changes. It doesn't mean anything has to be done about it." Marin said, "I know." She did know. She had spent enough time in enough small places to understand how that worked. As long as it stays words. Doris said, "Has it not?" Marin said, "Not yet." The yet sat between them for a moment. Then Doris said, "Webb Farley." Marin said, "He came by again last week with a question about the east fence line, which, as far as I can tell, isn't near his property." Doris set down her cup. "What did Bram say?" "Bram wasn't here. He was out with the herd." She paused. Farley stayed for 20 minutes. Doris said, "Did he behave himself?" Marin said, "Depends on how you define it." She thought about how to describe it accurately. He was polite. He kept finding reasons to stand between me and the door. Small things. Maybe deliberate, maybe not. He asked me again whether I had family in the area. Doris said, "He's looking to see if you're anchored." "I know," Marin said. "I told him I was as anchored as I needed to be." Doris looked at her. And he said that was a shame, because a woman like me deserved better than borrowed accommodation. The way Samerson said, "borrowed accommodation," made clear that she was quoting precisely, which also made clear that she had turned those exact words over quite a few times since they'd been said to her. Doris made a sound that was not quite a word. Marin said, "I am not going to do anything about Farley. He hasn't done anything that I can point to. He's just present, in a way that takes up more space than it should." Doris said, "You should tell Bram." Marin said, "Bram has a ranch to run." Doris said, "Marin, I can manage Webb Farley," Marin said, and her voice had the particular quality it got sometimes flat and absolute, the sound of someone who has handled worse and knows it. "I've managed worse than Webb Farley." Doris let it go. But the way she let it go told Marin that Doris was going to say something to Calvin, and Calvin was going to say something to Bram, and the conversation she was trying to avoid was going to happen regardless. It happened on a Thursday. Bram came in from the north pasture at midday instead of supper, which was unusual enough that she looked up from the accounts when she heard his boots on the porch. He came into the study, not the kitchen, the study, where she'd set up her working space, and he closed the door, which he had never done before. He said, "Calvin told me about Farley." She said, "I handled it." He said, "I know you did." He was not angry. He was doing the careful thing he did when he had something to say that required precision. "I want to know what he said," she told him. Exactly what she'd told Doris, without additions or subtractions. She had gotten good at recount things accurately without interpretation, because she'd learned that that was what made the information useful. When she finished, Bram was quiet for a long moment. He said, "He's been circling since October," she said. "I noticed." He said, "I should have said something to him sooner." She said, "You don't owe me." "It's not about owing you anything," he said, and the edge in his voice was not directed at her, but it was sharp enough that it stopped her. "He's been coming onto this property under false pretenses and making you uncomfortable. That's not something I'm willing to ignore because it's awkward to address." He paused. "I'll speak to him," she said. "He'll say I'm being oversensitive." "He can say what he wants," Bram said. "I'll say what I want." She looked at him. He was at the window, not looking at her, looking out at the yard where Pete was showing Nell how to properly close a gate latch. His jaw was doing the controlled thing it did when he was keeping something in check. She said, Bram, I appreciate it. I do. But I need you to understand that what he says about me, the things people are saying in town, none of that is going to stop just because you talk to him. He said, I know. She said, and I'm not asking you to protect me from what people think. He turned from the window then. He looked at her directly, which he did when things were important, and he wanted to make sure the words arrived as intended. He said, I'm not trying to protect you from what people think. I'm telling Farley to stay off my property unless he has actual business here. A pause. That's not about what people think. That's about property and conduct. She held his gaze. She said, all right. He said, all right, and he went back out. She sat in the study for a moment after he left, looking at the accounts book without seeing it, thinking about the difference between a man who protected a woman because he thought she was helpless and a man who drew a line because something had crossed it. She had spent enough of her life around the first kind to recognize the sex assigned when she encountered him. She went back to the accounts. Summer came in fully by June and brought with it the long, brutal days that were the actual business of a cattle ranch branding season, the long drives to the closer markets, the endless maintenance of fences and equipment and water systems that the winter cold had damaged in ways that were only visible when you tried to use them again. Marin's days stretched too. The kitchen ran hotter, the workload ran heavier, and she had added to her existing responsibilities a kitchen garden that she had planted in April and was now, in June, producing enthusiastically and in quantities she had not entirely anticipated. The garden had been a practical decision. Fresh vegetables were expensive and scarce, and the ranch's winter diet had been exactly as monotonous and limited as the accounts suggested, and it had worked, perhaps, too well. She had more squash than she knew what to do with by the second week of July. She put Pete in charge of delivering surplus to the two nearest ranch families. Pete was 17, and this was the first official responsibility anyone had ever given him that wasn't directly supervised. And he took it with the exaggerated seriousness of someone who understands that how you do small things says something about how you do large ones. Nell went with him because Nell went everywhere Pete was allowed to take her, and because the Hendersons' ranch, which was one of their stops, had a daughter named Clara who was Nell's age, and had become, over the spring, Nell's most important person outside of Hollister Ridge. They played in a way that Marin found painful in the best possible way to observe. The unguarded, full-body, completely unconscious play of children who have not yet learned to be careful about joy. Marin watched Nell come back from those afternoons. She watched the way her daughter arrived home, dirty, tired, chattering, completely present in the way that children are when they've been fully used up by a good day. She thought about the silent child on the train bench in October. She thought about how a person, even a small one, could change so completely in less than a year. She thought about what it would mean to leave. She was still asking herself that question. She hadn't stopped asking it. Exactly. She'd just stopped asking it urgently. It had moved. Its windows were dark. It had moved from the front of her thinking to somewhere further back, something she checked onto occasionally, rather than something that kept her up. She had not told anyone that. She was not sure she'd fully told herself. It was the third week of August when Doris Hatch said the thing that cracked something open in Marin that she hadn't known was sealed. They were in the kitchen after supper, just the two of them. Doris was mending something that didn't look mendable, a work shirt of Calvin's that had more patches on it than original fabric at this point, and Marin was working on the accounts for the week. Most of its windows were dark, and they were talking in the easy way that had developed between them. One of them saying something and the other responding when she had something worth responding with, and both of them comfortable with the gaps. Doris said without looking up from the shirt, "You know they're talking about the Henderson land." Marinson said, "What about it? Old Hendersons are thinking of selling the East Quarter. Bill Henderson told Calvin they can't manage it anymore, not with his back the way it is." Marin said, "How many acres?" 40. Good bottomland mostly. Has that creek running through it. Marin did what she always did, which was run numbers without meaning to. 40 acres of bottomland with water access. She knew what that was worth. She knew what you could do with it. She said, "Who's likely to buy?" Doris said, "Greer's been sniffing around." She paused. "And Farley." Marin said that would put Farley's east boundary right up against. She stopped. Doris said, "Right up against Hollister Ridge's southwest corner." Yes, a silence. Doris said, "Still not looking up from the shirt, Bram could make an offer." Marin said, that's Bram's decision. Doris said, I know it is another stitch. I'm just saying it's information worth having. Marin said, I'll mention it to him. Doris said, a pause that had something in it. You could also just suggest to Bill Henderson that there might be interested buyers who aren't Greer or Farley. Doesn't have to be a formal thing. Marin looked at her. She said, Doris, what exactly are you suggesting? Doris finally looked up. She said, I'm suggesting that you've been here a year, this October, and you're still talking about this place like you're a guest in it. The sentence landed flat and clean, no ornamentation on it. Marin said, I work here. Doris said, you run half of it. You reorganized the supply ordering. You found $64 Delacroix was stealing right out from under him. You built that garden from nothing, and it's been feeding 12 people since June. You sat up with those accounts through February when the books hadn't been straight in 18 months. She put the shirt down. I'm not saying you owe this place anything. I'm saying this place is yours in every way except the legal one, and I wonder sometimes if you've noticed that. Marin said, I've noticed it. Doris said, have you? The question was not unkind. It was the question of someone who knows you well enough to see the place where you've been lying to yourself and cares enough to point at it without pretending it isn't there. Marin looked at the accounts book in front of her. She said, I notice things, and I put them in a place where I can look at them later, when it's safe to look at them. Doris said, Marin, is it not safe yet? She didn't answer immediately. She sat with it, which was something she'd learned to do, to not fill silence immediately just because silence felt like a question needing answering. She sat with it and she thought about what safe meant and what she had actually been waiting for all these months. What the condition was that she'd been unconsciously waiting to satisfy before she let herself believe in this place fully. She said, finally, I don't know what I'm waiting for. Doris picked the shirt back up. She said, I think you're waiting to see if it stays. Marin said, things don't always stay. Doris said, no, they don't. A pause, one more stitch, but some things do. You're allowed to notice which is which. September came, and the grass on the high prairie went that particular color it got at the end of summer. Not dead but finished, tawny and still, the color of something that has done everything it was going to do for the year and is now just waiting for winter to make it official. Marin had started quietly to think about the Henderson land, not as something she had any claim to or any right to influence, but she'd started thinking about it in the way she thought about the accounts, as a puzzle with a logical solution, as a set of numbers organized correctly pointed toward something better than the current arrangement. If Bram bought the east quarter, it would add to the water access for the herd and cut the summer grazing rotation distance significantly. She had worked out the numbers on a page she kept folded in the back of the accounts book and looked at sometimes when she was trying to understand whether her thinking was practical or wishful. She told Bram about the Henderson land on a Thursday evening when the crew had gone and the house was quiet. She set the folded paper in front of him and let him read it. He was quiet while he read it, which was how he was with numbers. He gave them the same deliberate, unhurried attention he gave everything, and she had learned not to try to anticipate his response. He said, you work this out. I had time last week when the accounts were caught up. He turned the page over and looked at the blank back of it, as if hoping for more. He said, if this creek access is reliable, the east pasture rotation becomes significantly more efficient. I know. She pointed to a line near the bottom. And that's at current cattle numbers. If you expand in spring, like you were talking about in July, he said the numbers change. She said, yes. He set the paper down. He looked at her. She said, you don't have to do anything with it. I just thought it was worth knowing before someone else bought it. He said, how long did this take you? She said, a few evenings. It wasn't. It's not complicated, just tedious, he said, Marin. I do know the difference between complicated and tedious. And I know the difference between someone who works because it's expected and someone who works because they can't stop seeing the next problem that needs solving. She didn't respond to that. He said, I'm going to make an offer on the Henderson land. She said, that's a good decision. He said, it's a good decision partly because you did the work to show me it was. She said, that's what I'm here for. He said, is it? Not a question. Not quite, she said. Bram, he said, I'm not asking you to define anything tonight. He paused, and she watched him choose his words with a care that he used when he meant them specifically. I want you to know that what you bring to this place it's not interchangeable. You're not interchangeable. I know you've been waiting to see if it's safe to believe that. She stared at him. He said, Doris talks to Calvin, and the near expression on his face was not quite apologetic, but acknowledged that he was in possession of information he maybe shouldn't have deployed. She should have been annoyed. Part of her was. Part of her was also aware that her face was doing something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she looked down at the table and pressed her hand flat against the wood and breathed for a second. She said, I don't know what to say to that. He said, You don't have to say anything. He stood up. I'm going to talk to Bill Henderson in the morning. He picked up the folded paper. Can I keep this? She said yes. He said good night. She said good night, and he left. And she sat at the table for a long time after, with the quiet house around her, and the night outside, and the first cool edge of autumn coming in under the door. She thought about what Doris had said, about things that stay. She thought about Nell, asleep in the cottage, who had started sleeping with one of the picture books open beside her, instead of just the cloth rabbit she'd been clutching in October. She thought the kitchen garden going dormant now, but there permanently, in the ground, seeds already forming that would be there in spring, whether or not anyone specifically chose them. She thought about the accounts book on the desk in the study, with her handwriting in it, going back to October. All those months of work recorded in columns, clean and precise, the evidence of a year that had mattered. She thought about staying. She did not decide anything that night. She wasn't ready to decide anything, but for the first time since she had stepped off a train in October with 43 cents and a sleeping daughter, and no idea what came next, the idea of staying did not feel like the thing she was allowing herself while she waited for the real answer. It felt like the real answer. She got up and turned off the lamp and went across to the cottage and checked Nell and climbed into her own bed. And outside the wind was coming again. The first suggestion of the autumn wind that would eventually turn into the winter wind that she now knew how to live inside. Because she had learned it here. In this, she fell asleep thinking of water moving through creekland that didn't belong to anyone yet. And in the morning, the first thing she did was get up and start the fire before the cold had a chance to settle in. That, at least, had not changed. The Henderson land deal closed on a Tuesday in early October, just under a year from the night Marin had stepped off the train. Bram came back from town with the deed folded inside his coat and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, the way he handled most things that mattered to him quietly, without announcing that they mattered. Marin was at the stove, and she glanced at it, and then at him, and he said, Bill took the offer. Greer came in higher, but Bill said he'd rather see it go to someone who'd used the creek right. She said, Did Greer make trouble about it? He said, Greer always makes trouble. It doesn't always come to anything. She set a plate down in front of him. He looked at the deed for a moment, then at her, and there was something in his expression that was close to satisfaction, but more complicated than that. The look of a man who has made a decision that feels correct and is letting himself acknowledge it, which for Bram was a significant act of self-permission. He said, You should come out and look at the creek land when it dries out. I want to know what you think about the east access. She said, All right, that was all. But she thought about it after he left. I want to know what you think, and what it meant coming from a man who did not ask questions unless he intended to act on the answers. She was still not ready to name what was building between them. She had decided sometime in September that she was not going to name it until she had to, because naming things gave them weight and expectations, and her relationship with expectations had been difficult enough lately. But she was also no longer pretending it wasn't there, which was progress of a kind. October came in gray and sharp-edged, the anniversary of her arrival wearing weather appropriate to the occasion. Nell had just turned 6. They celebrated with a cake that Doris helped make, and that came out slightly lopsided, which Nell declared made it better. And with a pair of new boots that were the first new thing Nell had owned in over a year. She put them on and walked around the kitchen in them with the purposeful expression of some testing important equipment. She said, They make a good sound. Calvin, who had stopped by for coffee, and the cake said, A good sound. Nell said, When I walk, a good boot sound. She demonstrated, walking from one end of the kitchen to the other with great deliberateness. Calvin looked at Doris. Doris was pressing her lips together the way she did when she was not going to laugh in front of the child. Calvin said, That is a good boot sound. Marin watched her daughter own that kitchen in her new boots, utterly at ease, utterly at home, and the feeling that moved through her was so large and so complicated that she had to look out the window for a moment to get it under control. 1 year. They had been here 1 year. The rain started on a Thursday in the second week of October, and it did not stop. This was not immediately alarming. Late autumn rains were part of life on the plains, and the first 2 days were simply wet inconvenient for the men working outside, hard on the cattle that needed moving to higher pasture, annoying for Nell, who could not go to the Henderson place to see Clara and who had exhausted her indoor activities by mid-afternoon on day 1. The Black Alder River, which ran through the low eastern corner of the valley, including the new Henderson acreage, rose a few feet, and everyone kept an eye on it, the way you kept an eye on a neighbor's dog that had never bitten anyone, but had a look that suggested it had thought about it. By the end of the second day, Marin noticed Bram checking the sky in a particular way. Not the casual weather reading of someone wondering if they need a heavier coat, but the focused, assessment of a man looking at something that is becoming a problem and trying to get ahead of it. She said on Thursday night at supper, "How bad?" He said. "The alder's at 6 feet. She said, "What's flood stage?" He said, 8, maybe 9, depending on what's upstream. He paused. "There's been more rain up in the hills. I sent Pete out to check the North Bridge this afternoon." She said, and he said it's holding. For now. The crew ate quietly that night. She noticed that the way the table had a different texture to it, the particular alertness of men who work outside and understand weather in their bodies in a way that indoor people don't. Roy ate fast and kept glancing at the door. Calvin had his jaw set. Even Pete, who was 17 and ordinarily hard to worry, was not talking the way he usually talked. After supper, Bram pulled Calvin aside, and they stood in the hallway for a long time talking in low voices. Marin's of its windows were dark. Marin cleared the table and listened without making it obvious that she was listening, which was a skill she'd had as long as she could remember. She heard South Pasture before first light, the lower herd needs, and then something she couldn't catch, and then Calvin's voice saying the Decker family's already moving their livestock, and Bram saying tell Roy to take 2 men to the East Ridge and check the Henderson Creek. She heard the words Henderson Creek and thought about the land she'd mapped out in numbers on a folded piece of paper. She thought about 40 acres of bottomland with a creek running through it. Creek at flood stage. She did the geography in her head. The Henderson acreage sat in the lowest part of the valley's eastern arm. The Black Alder drew water from 2 tributary creeks, one of which ran through that land directly. If the Alder crested, she went to find Bram. He was in the study pulling on his heavier coat. She said, "The Henderson Creek feeds directly into the Alder just below the Henderson land. If the main river crests, the water has nowhere to go except back up through that tributary." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. She said the lower pasture. "Your south fence line runs along the bottom of that tributary valley." He said, "I know where my fence line is." "I know you do," she said. "I'm telling you the water will hit the south pasture before it hits anything else. Before the road. Before the North Bridge. The south pasture first?" He was looking at the map on the study walls. She could see him running the same geography she'd just run, checking it against what she'd said. His expression confirmed what she already knew, which was that she was right. He said, "I've got 40 head in the south pasture." She said, "I know. You moved them there Monday." He said, "I need to get them out tonight." She said, "Yes." He was already moving toward the door. He stopped and turned back and said, "Marin, if this gets bad." He paused, and she could see him thinking through something rapidly. "The Ridge Road stays passable longer than the Valley Road. If families start coming up," she said, "I'll handle it." He said, "I don't know how long I'll be across the river." She said, "Bram, go get your cattle. I'll handle everything here." He looked at her for one long moment, the specific look he gave things he was about to trust and wanted to be certain about first. She held it steadily because she had nothing to hide in it. He said, "Don't let Pete do anything stupid." She said, "Pete does something stupid approximately every third day, regardless of my involvement." He almost smiled. He went out into the rain. By midnight, the rain had become something different. Not heavier exactly, but more serious. The kind of rain that has stopped being weather and started being a statement. Most of its windows, Marin had sent Nell to sleep in the main house with Doris, not because the cottage was in danger, but because she needed to be able to move quickly and freely and Nell at 6 years old had not yet learned that staying put could be its own form of help. She had put 4 lanterns in the main house windows in the museum, one in each side facing the road, because if people were moving in the dark, they needed something to find. She had built up the fires in the main house and in the barn carefully in the barn, because fire and wet hay had their own particular catastrophic potential, and she had put on water to heat. Pete came in from checking the south road at midnight, and he was soaked to the skin, and his face was the color of a person who has seen something they weren't ready for. He said, "Mrs. Whitlock, the alders over its banks." She said, "How far over?" He said, "South road's underwater, maybe 1.5 feet, 2 feet in the low spot by the old cottonwood." He was shaking, from cold or from the information or both. The Deacon family. They were trying to come up the valley road, and their wagon the front wheel went off the edge where the road dropped and the water came in, and he stopped. She said, "Are they safe?" He said, "Yes." They got out. "But the wagon's gone. Mrs. Deacon and the 3 kids, they're on foot somewhere between here and the South Crossing." She said, "In this?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She turned to Roy, who had come in from the barn 5 minutes earlier. She said, "Roy, take Pete and the wagon, the big one, not the light one, and go out the ridge road east, not the valley road. It's impassable. Come around the long way to the South Crossing." "Can you get there that way?" Roy said, "It's 4 miles longer." She said, "Can you get there?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Go." She looked at Pete. "You coat? Dry one from the hook." She pointed, "And take a lantern." "Do you know what Mrs. Deacon looks like?" Pete said, "I know her from church." She said, "Go find her." They went. She was already turning back to the house. The Deacon family arrived at 1:30 in the morning. Eleanor Deacon and her 3 children, the youngest of whom was barely 2 years old, and was crying with the specific desperation of a very small person, who has been cold and frightened for too long. Roy had found them huddled against the base of a fence post on the high side of the road, Eleanor Deacon, with her oldest daughter's coat pulled over both of them, her 2 boys standing on either side like they were trying to keep the rain off their mother by proximity alone. Maren had dry blankets and hot water ready. She stripped the children down with Doris's help and got them wrapped and near the fire. Eleanor Deacon sat in the kitchen chair and held her youngest and shook, not crying, just shaking, the whole body releasing what it had been holding together for the last 2 hours. Maren put a cup of hot broth in her hands and said, "You did right, getting up to the road." Eleanor said, "The wagon Daniel's going to be relieved his family is safe," Maren said. "Everything else can be dealt with later." The woman looked at her. She had never met Maren, had perhaps heard about her, the widow at Hollister Ridge, with all that word entailed in this community. She said, "Who are you?" Maren said, "Maren Whitlock. I work here." She handed over a second cup for the oldest child. "Drink that." She didn't have time for more introduction than that, because at 20 minutes to 2 in the morning, she heard wagons on the ridge road, and it turned out to be the Greer family. Not Aldous Greer himself, who was presumably managing his own property, but his wife Margaret and her adult daughter and the daughter's husband and their 4 children, who had come up the ridge road in the dark because their valley house was taking water at the back door and rising. Maren opened the door before they knocked. She said, "Come in. There's room in the barn for the horses. Pete will show you." Then she looked at Margaret Greer, who was somewhere in her 50s, sharp-faced, with rain on her glasses, and an expression that combined profound relief with the social complication of being in the home of someone whose husband she knew had been critical of the woman now standing in the doorway. She said, "Mrs. Greer, I'm glad you made it. Come in out of the rain." Margaret Greer came in. By 3 in the morning, there were 14 people in the main house and barn at Hollister Ridge who did not live there, and the number was climbing. The Henderson family came. Bill Henderson moving painfully on his bad back, his wife supporting him, 2 of their grown sons carrying their most important belongings in grain sacks. Clara Henderson, Nell's friend, found Nell in the parlor, wrapped in a quilt, and fell asleep against her. Within 10 minutes of arriving, the 2 of them curled up in the chair like the weather was entirely irrelevant. Maren watched that from the doorway and felt something fierce and inarticulate move through her. Then she went back to work. The barn had become a makeshift shelter for the families who'd arrived with horses and livestock, and Maren had organized it the way she organized the kitchen, by what was needed immediately and what could wait, by which problem was on fire and which one was merely smoldering. Dry bedding from the upper loft, a fire in the barrel stove at the far end, far from the hay. The cots from the bunkhouse that the ranch hands weren't using because the ranch hands were all either out with Bram or managing livestock or making the ridge road passable for more wagons. She did not issue orders. She made assessments and stated what was needed, and the men who were there, Roy, the Henderson sons, Greer's son-in-law, a man named Thomas Fletcher, who'd arrived alone from the East Road with a gash on his arm from where he'd caught a fence wire in the dark. They did the work. She hadn't expected that to be as straightforward as it was. She had expected some version of what she'd been living with for a year. The sideways look, the hesitation, the man who agrees with you and then does something else. What she got instead was men who were frightened and wet and needed someone to tell them what to do, and she was the person telling them. So they did it. Roy Garrett, of all people, was the one she relied on most. He knew the property better than anyone except Bram, and he moved through the crisis with a competence that she had always known he had, and that he had always, until tonight, been too proud to direct toward anything she was involved in. He checked on the livestock without being asked. He made sure the fire in the barn was safe. When a second wagon came up the ridge road at close to 4 a.m, the Mallory family, 6 of them, with 3 of their cattle roped to the back of the wagon, he went out in the rain to help them in without anyone saying a word. She noticed that. She filed it away. The moment that nearly broke her composure came at around 4:30. She had gone back to the cottage to get extra blankets from the storage chest, moving fast, just not wanting to be away from the main house for more than a few minutes. She was coming back across the yard when she heard a sound from the direction of the south pasture, carried on the wind, thin and awful and unmistakable. Cattle in water. Not just distressed, but fighting. She stood in the yard in the rain and listened, and her mind ran the calculation. Bram had gone south to move the herd before the water came up. If he hadn't gotten them all out, if some of them were trapped, if the fence line had gone under before he could. And Bram was somewhere on the other side of that water. She stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and she let herself feel exactly how frightened she was. She let it be real, the full weight of it, because she had learned that pretending fear wasn't there, just made it find its way out sideways. 3 seconds, 4. She felt it. Then she went back inside, because there was nothing she could do about what was happening in the south pasture, except make sure that everything on this side of the water was managed well enough that when Bram got back there, was something worth returning to. She put the blankets down and she went to find Roy. She said, "The south pasture. I heard cattle in water." Roy's face went careful. He said, "Bram's out there." She said, "I know." "Can you get anyone out to the ridge above the south crossing?" "Not down to the water above it. High ground." "If any of them can be driven up," Roy said, "the ridge trail on the east side." "Yes." He was already pulling his coat back on. 2 men. "The rest stay here," she said. "Yes." She paused. Roy. "Be careful," he said. "Always am," which was not entirely true, but was the right thing to say. He went. She went back to the kitchen and put more wood on the fire and made more coffee and checked on Eleanor Deacon's youngest, who had finally stopped crying and was asleep on the settee, and she kept moving because stopping was not something she could afford. The moment the flood crested came at close to 6 a.m, and it came without announcement. Not a wall of water, nothing dramatic, just a point at which the sounds from the south stopped changing, and the water that had been seeping under the barn door stopped creeping forward and held where it was. Now Cairn was in the barn when she noticed it, watching the water line, and she did not say anything for 10 minutes because she wanted to be sure. Then she said quietly, to no one in particular, "I think it's holding." Bill Henderson was sitting on a hay bale nearby. He said, "Creek sounds different." She said, "Yes." He listened. He said, "You're right. It's holding." She let out a breath that she had been holding since approximately 1 a.m. Dawn came gray and soaked, the sky the color of a dirty wool blanket. The rain was still falling, but thinly now, not the driving downpour of the night, but a residual drip, the storm finishing its business. People started waking up, and the house children first, in the barn, and the house children first, always children first, with the immediate and non-negotiable demands of children who are too young to understand that the adults around them have not slept. Marin made breakfast. This was not a decision so much as the obvious next thing. 14 extra people needed food, and she had enough in the kitchen if she was creative. and she was very good at being creative with what she had. She made porridge in the big pot, the one she normally used for the ranch hands during branding week, and there was enough salt pork left for flavor and enough of the garden's stored root vegetables to make it substantial. It was not elegant. It was hot, and it was filling, and it was there. Eleanor Deacon came to the kitchen and said, "Can I help?" Marin said, "Yes. Stir that and don't let it stick." Eleanor stirred. After a moment, she said, "My husband is going to come looking for us." Marin said, "From the south or east?" "East, probably. He was at the Fletcher place when it started." Marin said, "The east road is passable above the first crossing. If he's careful, he can get through." Eleanor said, "How do you know that?" Marin said, "Roy checked it at 2 in the morning." She said it plainly, the way she said things that had simply been done because they needed doing, without any particular emphasis on the fact that she was the one who'd sent Roy to check it. Eleanor looked at her. She said, "You've been up all night." Marin said, "Most of it." Eleanor said, "This is your home." Marin said, "Yes." She said it before she thought about it. She heard herself say it, and she felt the truth of it hit her in a way it hadn't quite hit before. Direct and certain, like the answer to a question she'd been asking for a year. Eleanor, who had no idea what that word meant to the woman stirring beside her, said then, "Thank you for sharing it." Bram came back at 8:30 in the morning. She heard the horse before she saw him a sound on the ridge road that made her put down what she was doing and go to the window, and she recognized the animal's gait even at a distance. She went to the door and opened it. He was soaked through, and there was mud on him from somewhere below his knee, and a cut on his right hand that had been bleeding and stopped. He was leading the horse rather than riding it, which told her something about how the night had been. He looked at the barn, at the wagons in the yard, at the smoke from the house, and the people visible through the windows. And then he looked at her standing in the doorway. He stood there for a moment. She said, "How many did you lose?" He said, 3 head, maybe 4. I couldn't. The water came up faster than he stopped. He looked at the yard again, at everything that was here that hadn't been here yesterday morning. "How many people?" she said. 22. 14 in the house, 8 in the barn. The Deacons, Hendersons, Greers, Malaras, and Fletcher with his family. She paused. No injuries beyond Fletcher's arm, and Doris stitched that at 2 this morning. He looked at the barn. He looked at the house. He looked at Roy, who had appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, and gave Bram a single nod, the kind of nod that communicates a great deal in a small gesture. He said, "The ridge road?" She'd clear. Roy kept it clear. He said, "The south fence?" She said, "Down in 2 places. It can be fixed." He said, "The cattle?" She said, "Roy and the Henderson boys got 7 head up to the ridge pasture before the water crested. The rest were already where you'd moved them." He stood in the yard in the thin morning rain looking at all of this, and she could see him processing, not just the numbers and the damage assessment, but what all of it meant together, what it represented. He had left a ranch and a woman managing it, and come back to find a functioning shelter with 22 people in it, and a woman who could tell him exactly what had happened to every animal and every road and every person. He said, "Marin," she said, "you need to get dry and eat something." He said, "In a minute." He walked toward her and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her and said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm fine." He said, "That's not what I asked." She said, "I'm tired." He said, "That's closer." He looked at her steadily. "I heard the alder from half a mile out. I couldn't get back faster. The crossing was gone. I had to go north and find—" He stopped. "I didn't know what I was going to find when I got back here." She said, "We were fine." He said, "I can see that." She said, "Bram, come inside." Hey, said, "I need you to know." And then he stopped again, and she recognized the thing happening in him, the thing where he had something to say and was trying to find the version of it that was precise enough to mean what he meant. He said, "When I couldn't get back, when I was stuck on the other side of the river in the dark, not knowing what was happening here, the thing I kept thinking about wasn't the cattle." She said nothing. He said, "I kept thinking about you and Nell." The words sat between them in the rain. She said, "We were safe." He said, "I know that now." He climbed the 2 steps to the porch and stopped in front of her, and he said, "I know you were safe, and I know you handled everything, and I know you probably didn't need me here to do it." He was close enough that she could see how tired he was, how stripped down to essentials the night had left him. "But I need you to know that it mattered to me, that you were here, that both of you." He paused. "It mattered." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the very first night, in front of the feed store, reading for the truth behind the face. What she saw was the same thing she had seen then. No performance, no management, just the plain statement of a plain man who meant exactly what he said. She said, "Go inside, Bram." He said, "All right." He went inside. She stood on the porch for one moment longer, looking out at the waterlogged yard, at the wagons and the smoke and the thin rain still falling, at everything that had happened in one night and was now improbably more or less all right. She was very tired. She was so tired she could feel it in her back teeth. She went inside. By noon, the valley road was passable enough for wagons to move carefully. Families began the slow process of returning cautiously with the particular subdued quality of people who have been through something and are not quite sure yet what it cost them. The Henderson boys checked the South Bridge and reported it damaged but crossable for light wagons. Daniel Deacon arrived from the east at 10 o'clock and found his family in the Hollister Ridge kitchen, and he stood in the doorway looking at his wife and children alive and warm, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked. Eleanor Deacon stood up and said, "The wagon's gone." He said, "I don't care about the wagon." She said, "The front wheel went." He said, "Eleanor, I don't care about the wagon." Marin took Nell and went to check on the barn animals so the Deacons could have the kitchen. One by one through the morning and into the afternoon, the families at Hollister Ridge gathered themselves and went home to count their own damages. They left with dry blankets, borrowed and leftover porridge packed, and in several cases with men from the Hollister crew helping them with wagons and animals. They left the way people leave a place they didn't expect to be, but found safety in, with a specific kind of gratitude that is not quite comfortable, because it is the gratitude of having needed something and having had it given. Margaret Greer was the last family to leave. She found Marin in the barn, and she stood for a moment as if she was deciding something, and then she said, "My husband has said some things about you." Marin said, "I've heard." Margaret said, "He's wrong." Marin looked at her. Margaret said, "He's wrong, and I'll be telling him that." She was not a woman who found apology comfortable. That was clear. She was too much like her husband for it to come easily, but she was making the effort, and Marin could see that the effort was genuine. "You opened your home to us. You didn't have to," Marin said. "You were in the rain." Margaret said, "I know, but not everyone in this valley would have opened their door." Marin thought about a train station in October. She thought about a station master with a carpetbag. She thought about cold wind and 43 cents and a sleeping child and the specific particular deprivation of having nowhere to go. She said, "Someone opened their door for me once, when I needed it." Margaret looked at her, and then she did something unexpected. She reached out and briefly pressed Marin's hand with her own, the way older women do when they mean something they don't have a different way to say. Then she went out to find her family and the wagon home. Bram was in the study that evening when the house had finally gone quiet. All the families gone, the crew fed, and mostly in the bunkhouse. Nell's asleep in the cottage with the deep absolute sleep of a child who has had an extraordinary day and doesn't entirely understand why. He was sitting at the desk with a lamp and a sheet of paper, but not writing anything, just sitting there with the lamp and the paper and the quiet. Marin came in to get the accounts book she'd left on the corner of the desk. He said, "Sit for a minute." She sat. He said, "How bad is the damage, actually?" She said, "The south fence is the main thing. 2 sections down, 3rd section is damaged but standing. The creek access on the Henderson land is probably changed. The flood will have moved some of the bank. I'd want to look at it before I assume the numbers I gave you in September still hold." He said, "I'll go out with you tomorrow," she said. "All right." She paused. "The cattle you lost 3 head confirmed, you said." He said, "Maybe 4. I'll know better tomorrow." She said, "I'll adjust the inventory." He said, "Marin." He stopped. She waited. He said, "I've been thinking about the cottage." Something's in her went still and watchful, the old reflex, the one that waited for the thing to go wrong. He said, "The deed. When I bought the Henderson land, I had Bill draw up the paperwork through the same lawyer in town." He opened the desk drawer and took out a folded document, different from the Henderson deed, smaller, a single page. He said, "It's on the desk between them." I had him do a second piece of paperwork at the same time. She looked at the document. She did not pick it up yet. He said, "The cottage and the 6 acres around it. I had them put in your name." He paused, and Nell's jointly. She looked at the document. She looked at him. He said, "You've earned it." That's not. I want to be clear that this is not. He was choosing his words with the precision he always used when he needed them to be exact. This isn't me giving you something because I feel sorry for you, or because you've been useful, or because I want something in return. This is me acknowledging what's been true for a while, which is that the work you've done on this ranch, the money, the system you built, what you did last night, that cottage and that land belong to you by every measure I know how to apply. The legal part is just catching up to the actual part. She picked up the document. She read it. She read it through twice, carefully, the way she read everything, all the way to the edges, all the details, every line. Her name, Nell's name, the legal description of the property, the signature of the lawyer in Red Willow. She set it back down. She put her hand flat on it, the same gesture she'd used at this table months ago when she was trying to stay steady, pressing her palm against the wood. This time she pressed it against the document instead. He said, "You don't have to say anything right now." She said, "I know." Her voice was doing something she would have preferred it not to do, but she was too tired tonight to manage her voice and everything else simultaneously. She stopped. She tried again. "I spent the last year. I spent longer than that being someone's problem, someone's burden." She stopped again. He waited. He was very good at waiting. She said, "This is the first piece of paper with my name on it since Thomas died that isn't a notice of non-payment or a rejection." He said, "I know." She said, I'm not sure. She pressed the document harder. "Thank you." He said, "It's yours. It's always been yours in the way that matters. This is just the rest of it." She looked up at him then, and her face was doing the thing she couldn't control, and she didn't try to control it. She just looked at him, this careful, plain-spoken, difficult, decent man who had pulled a paper out of his desk drawer and handed her the most important thing anyone had given her in years, and who was now sitting quietly and letting her have it without making it about himself. He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to talk about. There are things I think we should talk about. Not tonight. I'm too tired tonight. But there are things." He said, "All right." He looked at her, and she could see the careful hope in him, the version of it that he kept controlled and steady the way he kept everything. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd learned that things worth wanting were worth being careful about. "I'll be here," she said, "I know." She picked up the document and the accounts book, and she went to the cottage where Nell was sleeping, and she sat in the chair by the wood stove with the deed in her hands, this paper with her name on it, and the fire held against the night the way it always had, the way she had come to trust it would. Outside, the prairie was wet and dark, and the black alder was settling back into its banks. Inside, for the first time since Thomas died, Maren Whitlock sat in a room that belonged to her. She slept 10 hours straight, which she had not done since before Thomas died. She woke to Nell standing beside the bed, with her boots already on, the good one, the birthday boots, that made the satisfying sound, and a piece of bread in her hand that she had clearly helped herself to from the kitchen, and an expression of elaborate patience that suggested she had been standing there for some time. Maren said, "How long have you been there?" Nell said, "A while." Maren said, "How long is a while?" Nell considered this. "Since the rooster." The rooster crowed at 5:30. Maren looked at the light in the window. It was closer to 7. She said, "Nell said you were sleeping. I didn't want to wake you." A pause. "But I've been very patient." Maren looked at her daughter, standing there in her birthday boots, with bread in her hand, 6 years old and entirely herself, and the feeling that moved through her was the kind that doesn't have a clean name. It was love, obviously, but it was also something else, something like recognition, like seeing clearly after a long time of not being able to. She said, "Come here." Nell climbed up onto the bed, bread and boots and all, and Maren pulled her in and held her for a moment without saying anything. And Nell permitted this with the tolerance of a child who understands that adults sometimes need things that don't make complete sense. Then Nell said into her mother's shoulder, "Is everything fixed now? From the water?" Maren said not all of it, but mostly. Nell said, "Clara's house had water in the kitchen." Maren said, "I know. The Henderson boys are cleaning it out today." Nell said, "Can I go help Clara?" Maren said, "Cleaning flood mud out of a kitchen is not helping for children. It's getting in the way." Nell was quiet for a moment, clearly searching for a counter-argument. Then she said, "I could hold things." Maren said, I'll ask Bram if Pete can take you over this afternoon, when the mud work is mostly done. Nell accepted this. She went back to her bread. After a moment, she said, Mama, are we going to stay here? Marin said, yes. She said it the same way she'd said it the night before to Eleanor Deacon before she thought about it. Out of the place where things are true before you've organized them into language. But this time she heard the certainty in her own voice and didn't feel the need to qualify it or walk it back. Nell said, good, with the complete satisfaction of someone for whom this was never really in question. She slid off the bed and went to the window and looked out at the wet yard and said, there's a lot of mud. Marin said, there is. Nell said, we should get chickens that like mud. Marin said, I'll look into that, and got up to start the fire. The conversation she'd told Bram they needed to have did not happen that day or the day after. There was too much to do. The flood cleanup was the kind of work that expanded to fill all available time and then borrowed some from the next day fence lines down. Creek banks reshaped, equipment that had gotten wet and needed drying and oiling, the barn floor that needed mucking out where the water had seeped in, the accounts that needed updating to reflect what had been lost and what had been damaged and what the repair costs were going to run. Sukizin, Marin threw herself into it the way she threw herself into all necessary work completely without reservation, because partial effort had never been in her nature, and because work, she had learned over the last year, was the thing that made her feel most like herself. Not because she didn't have other ways of existing, but because doing something well and knowing it was well done was the most reliable form of steadiness she had ever found. The accounting of the flood damage took 3 days. She worked through it methodically: cattle losses, fence, repair estimates, the equipment that had been damaged, the feed that had gotten wet and would need replacing. She also, if its windows were dark. She also worked through the other column, the one that most people wouldn't have thought to create. What the ranch had spent sheltering 22 people for a night and morning. Food, bedding, lamp oil, firewood. She put together a complete picture, and she set it in front of Bram on the 4th morning after the flood, and he read it without comment for a long time. He said, the total loss. She said, on the cattle and the fence, yes. The shelter costs are separate. I listed them separately because I wasn't sure if you wanted to. He said, cross them out. She said, Bram. He said, cross them out. The shelter costs aren't a loss. That's just what you do. He said it the same way he said everything fundamental, without emphasis, as if it were simply obvious, as if there were no other reasonable position. What's the net damage excluding those? She crossed them out and gave him the number. He looked at it and nodded slowly, the nod of a man calculating something longer than the immediate problem. He said, the Henderson acreage changed the creek access, the way you thought it might. She said, I went out with Roy yesterday. The bank shifted about 15 feet east in the flood. The access point is actually slightly better now than what I modeled in September, he said. She said. The channel deepened, more reliable water through a dry summer. He said, so the September numbers were conservative. She said, the spring expansion you were considering, I think it's more viable than the numbers suggested, not less. He looked at her. He said, you went out with Roy. She said, he knows where the east boundary runs better than I do. A pause. Something was working in Bram's expression, something between amusement and a more complicated feeling. He said, Roy Garrett spent the first 4 months you were here trying to get me to reconsider your employment. She said, I know. He said, and now he's walking the creek line with you. People change their minds when the evidence is sufficient. He said, or when a person earns their place. She said, same thing, maybe. He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention he had, direct, unhurried, not trying to land anywhere specific, but simply looking at her the way you look at something you want to understand accurately. He said, Marin, when do you want to have that conversation? She said, this evening, after supper. He said, all right. She went back to the study. She was aware for the rest of the day of something humming underneath the ordinary work. Not anxiety exactly, or not only anxiety. Something with more brightness in it than anxiety usually had. Doris knew something was happening the way Doris knew most things, which was before anyone told her. She came into the kitchen mid-afternoon while Marin was making bread, and she said, with the directness that was simply her natural mode, you have a particular look today. Marchian said, what kind of look? Doris said, the kind where you've made up your mind about something. Marin punched the bread dough. She said, I'm talking to Bram this evening. Doris said about. Maren said things. Doris poured herself coffee and sat down and did not say anything else, which was its own kind of eloquence. After a moment, Maren said, I don't know how to do this. I did it once the regular way, young, and Thomas and I had known each other since we were children, and it was different. Everything was assumed. There wasn't a conversation like the one I need to have tonight. It just was. Doris said, nothing about your situation is the regular way. Maren said, no, Doris said, that's not a problem. That's just true. Maren shaped the dough and covered it and wiped her hands. He said he wanted to be my equal partner. Those were the words he used. In the study, 2 days after the flood, when he gave me the deed, he said it like it meant something specific. Doris said, it does mean something specific. That's Bram not saying something vague. I know, Maren said. I know it means something specific. I just need to... She paused. I need him to understand what I'm bringing to it, not just what I have to offer as labor or competence, or I need him to understand what I need to stay who I am inside it. Because I had one version of a life that was built on assuming certain things would always be there, and then they weren't, and She stopped. Doris said, you're not going to build this one on assumptions. Maren said, no, Doris said, so say that. Maren looked at her. Doris said, just say it to him the way you just said it to me. He's not a complicated man, Maren. He's a private man. Those are different things. Private men don't need you to approach them sideways. They need you to say what you mean and trust them to do the same. Maren said, what if he... Doris said he won't. Maren said, you don't know that. Doris said, I've known Bram Hollister for 11 years. I know what it looks like when he's made up his mind. She drank her coffee. He made up his mind about you in October of last year. Standing in the train station in the dark. Maren was quiet for a moment. She said, that's a terrifying thing to say, Doris said. Probably, but true. They walked out to the old cottonwood after supper. It had not been planned exactly. She had thought the conversation would happen in the study or the kitchen, the practical rooms where most of the honest things between them had been said. But Bram had come in from checking on the recovered cattle in the east pasture, and he'd looked at her and said, walk with me. And she'd said yes, and they'd walked. And they ended up under the big cottonwood on the ridge above the barn, because that was where walking along the ridgeline went if you let it. The evening was clear and cold, and the cottonwood had most its leaves in the flood winds, and they lay in a yellow wreckage around the base of the tree. Below them the valley was visible in the fading light. The ranch, the barn, the cottage, with its window lit, the long dark line of the black alder back in its banks, the Henderson land in the east with the creek glinting. She could see from up here all the things she'd been in the middle of for the past year, the whole shape of it, the place that had been someone else's and had become, in some way she still didn't have complete language for also hers. She said, I've been thinking about what you said. He said, which part? She said, equal partners. She looked at the valley below. Most of its windows were dark. I need you to understand what that means to me, because it might mean something different to me than it does to you, and I'm not willing to find that out later. He said, tell me what it means. She said, it means the cottage and the acreage stay in my name, always, regardless of what else changes. He said, yes. I told you that. She said, I know. I'm saying it again because I need to hear you agree to it when we're specifically talking about this, and not when you've just handed me a deed and I'm too overwhelmed to think straight. He said, the cottage and the land are yours, always. That is not conditional on anything. She said, the accounts work. The supply management, the ordering system, the winter preparations, those stay mine. If I build something in this ranch, it stays built. I'm not going to be the person who improves things and then gets moved aside. He said, I have no interest in moving you aside. I barely managed before you got here. She said, that's not what I mean. I mean formally, structurally. I mean that if I'm a partner in this operation, I need to be recognized as that. He said, I can put that in writing. She looked at him. He said, I have a lawyer in Red Willow who has now done 2 pieces of paperwork for me in a month. He's probably wondering what's happening out here. I don't mind making it 3. She said, I'm serious. He said, Maren, I know you are. I'm also serious. If you want a formal arrangement that recognizes your role in this ranch, I will have it drawn up. I should have done it months ago. He paused. I didn't because I wasn't sure you'd want the permanence of it. I didn't want to push, she said. You gave me a deed to a cottage instead. He said, I gave you something that was yours regardless of what happened between us. Something that couldn't be taken back if the rest of it went wrong. She stared at him. She had not understood that at the time, had understood it as acknowledgement of her work, which it was, but had not seen the other layer of it until just now. He had made sure she had something that belonged to her unconditionally, before he said anything about what he wanted, because he understood that a woman who had spent a year waiting to see if the ground was real needed to have something solid under her feet before anyone could ask anything of her. She said, you thought that through. He said, I had a long, wet night on the other side of the river to think things through. She looked out over the valley. She said, Nell. He said, what about her? She said, she's 6 years old and she's already lost one father, and I will not. She stopped. She started again. I need to know that whatever we build, whatever this is, if it goes wrong or if something happens, she is not going to be the person who pays for it. She has the cottage. She has her name on that deed. But I need to know that she's going to be, that you're going to treat her as. Her voice did the thing she couldn't prevent when she talked about Nell in relation to the future. He said quietly, I know what it is to lose a father young. He said it without elaboration, just stated it as a fact. I was 9. I know what it leaves in a person. He was looking at the valley too, not at her, which made it easier somehow. I am not going to be Nell's father. That's not something I can be, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I can be someone who is always there, someone she can count on. He paused. I think she already does a little. She told Calvin last week that I know more about horses than anyone except possibly Pete, and that's high praise from her. Marin made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. He said, Nell is part of this. Whatever we build includes her. That's not a condition I'm accepting reluctantly. It's something I want. She believed him. She had been listening to this man say things for a year, and she had gotten very good at knowing when he meant them, and he meant this. She said, I'm not easy to be with. He said, I noticed. She said, I have strong opinions about things. A lot of things. I'm not going to defer to you, because you're the man, and this is your ranch. He said, I'd be disappointed if you did. The deferring has done me nothing good as a general rule. She said, I'm serious. He says, I know, so am I. He turned and looked at her then. Marin, I'm 51 years old. I have run this ranch for 23 years, and in that time I have hired and trusted and been wrong about people in ways that cost me considerably. I know what I want, a pause. I want the person who got up before sunrise on her first morning here and made biscuits and found the Delacroix problem and built a garden and kept 22 people warm in a flood and still can't quite let herself believe she's allowed to stay. He said it plainly, without any decoration on it. That's what I want. The whole thing. Not a managed version of it. She looked at him for a long time. She said, I'm scared. He said, that's fair. She said, not of you. Of wanting something this much. I got very good at not wanting things because it hurt less when they went away. He said, I know. She said, I don't know how to unlearn that quickly. He said, I'm not asking you to unlearn it quickly. I'm asking you to, he thought about the words the way he always did. I'm asking you to let it be all right to want this. You don't have to stop being careful. You don't have to stop checking the ground. You can want it and still check. He paused. I'll check with you. That was the thing. That was the thing that did it. Not a grand gesture, not a speech, just that. I'll check with you. The acknowledgement that she had been checking alone for a very long time and did not have to continue to do that. She said, he said. All right. They stood under the cottonwood for a while longer, without needing to say anything else, because the important things had been said, and they were both people who understood that adding more words to a thing that was complete just unmade it. Below them, the lamp in the cottage window was small and steady against the dark. She told Nell the next morning. Not everything. Not in the way that would have required explaining things Nell was too young to understand or needed to have in adult language. She told it in the way you tell a child true things, which is simply and without preparation, because children can usually handle truth better than the careful construction adults build around it. She said, you know that Bram and I are friends. Nell, eating porridge, said, yes. Marin said, we're going to be more than friends. We're going to all be family, the three of us. Nell looked up from her porridge. She said, like how me and Clara are like family. Marin said, like that, yes, but more permanent, official. Nell thought about this. She said, "Is Bram going to live in our cottage?" Marin said, "The cottage will still be ours. But yes, we'll all be together." Nell said, "Will we get more chickens?" Marin said, "That's a very reasonable question. I think that can be discussed." Nell seemed to accept this as satisfactory. She went back to her porridge. Then she said, without looking up, "I already called him Bram in my head instead of Mr. Hollister. Is that okay?" Marin said, "Yes, that's okay." Nell said, "Good. Mr. Hollister is a lot of words for one person." Roy Garrett heard about it from Calvin, who heard about it from Doris, before Bram had the chance to say anything formally, which was how information traveled at Hollister Ridge, and had probably always traveled there, and would continue to do so indefinitely. Roy came to find Marin in the study. This had become, over the months, less unusual than it would have been in November. He came to the doorway and stood with his hat, and he said, "I hear you and Bram are making it formal." She said, "That's the plan." He said, "Good." He said it the way he said things he meant, but didn't want to spend a lot of time on flat and direct, the verbal equivalent of a firm handshake. Then he said, "That thing you did, in the flood. The ridge road, the barn, the all of it." He paused. "That was good work." She looked at him. She said, "You kept the ridge road clear." He said, "I knew where the ridge road was. You knew what needed doing." She said, "We both knew what needed doing." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was as close to rueful as Roy Garrett's face was capable of producing. He said, "I wasn't easy on you." She said, "No." He said, "I should have been easier on you." She said, "Roy, you came around. That's the thing that matters." He said, "It took me too long." She said, "It took you the time it took you. Nobody changes on someone else's schedule." She meant it. She had long since stopped being angry about the early months with Roy, not because she was particularly forgiving by nature, but because she understood the thing that had been under his resentment, which was love for a place and a way of doing things, and that she could not, in good conscience, hold against a person. He put his hat back on. He said, "You're good for this place." She said, "I know." He almost smiled at that. It was not quite a smile. It was Roy Garrett, after all, but it was the closest she'd ever seen his face come to one when it was directed at her. He went back out. She sat in the study for a moment after he left and thought about how strange the world was. How a man who had spent 6 months trying to undermine her confidence in her own position was now the person she trusted most in an emergency. How the same place that had whispered about the penniless widow was the place she would spend the rest of her life. None of it had been predictable. None of it had been easy. And all of it had happened anyway, the way things happen when you are too stubborn to give up, and occasionally too tired to be as careful as you mean to be, and human enough to make mistakes along the way. The wedding was in Red Willow in the 3rd week of April. Not a large affair. This was not the kind of wedding that either of them would have wanted, and they had been in sufficient agreement about that from the first mention of it that no real discussion was necessary. It was a small gathering in the town hall, because the weather in April on the plains could not be trusted for an outdoor ceremony, and both of them knew it. The crew from Hollister Ridge, the Henderson family, the Hatch family, Eleanor Deacon, who came with Daniel, and the 3 children, including the smallest one who was now walking, and had opinions about everything. Margaret Greer came without her husband, which was notable, and she sat in the 2nd row and gave Marin a nod when she came in that said several things without saying any of them aloud. Webb Farley did not come. Nobody commented on this. Nell wore a new dress that Doris had helped make from fabric Marin had ordered from the supply catalog in February, planning ahead in the way she planned all things. The dress was blue, and Nell was extremely aware of it. She stood beside Marin during the ceremony with the seriousness of someone fulfilling an important official function and held the small bouquet of early spring flowers that Clara Henderson had helped her put together that morning and lost 2 of. Them somewhere between the Henderson wagon and the town hall door, but held the remaining ones with great dignity. The ceremony itself was brief and plain, performed by the circuit judge, who came through Red Willow monthly. Marin had not wanted words that didn't mean what they said, and the judge, who was a practical man, had given them words that meant what they said. She and Bram stood facing each other in front of the people who had become, over the course of a year, their community. Not a community she had been born into or inherited, but one she had arrived at from a different direction and had helped shape, even in the small ways that don't get recorded anywhere. When the judge asked if she took Bram Hollister, she said yes. The way she said things, she meant clearly, without hesitation, looking at him directly. He said it the same way back. Nell, at the precise moment the judge pronounced them married, said in a voice that carried clearly through the room, "Now can we get more chickens?" And the town hall erupted in laughter, and Marin closed her eyes for 1 second against the laughter and the warmth. And the fact that she was standing in a room full of people who were happy for her, which was something she had not had in so long that she had almost stopped believing it was possible. She opened her eyes. Bram was looking at her with that expression, the one that wasn't quite the almost smile but had grown over the months into something more open than that, something that let her see what was behind it. He said quietly, just to her, "More chickens seems reasonable." She said, "Don't tell her that yet. She'll never let it go." He said, "She already won't let it go. She's been planning the chicken expansion since February." She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "She told me. She has a whole system. She drew it out for Roy." Marin looked at her daughter, who was now showing the remaining flowers to Clara Henderson with great authority, and she thought about a child who had learned to be invisible and had, over the course of 1 year in one place, become a child who drew diagrams for ranch hands about chicken management. She thought about what it cost to let a child become themselves again, after fear has made them small. It cost staying. That was what it cost. It cost making the decision every day to stay and do the work and be present and not run from the things that frightened you. It was not a glamorous cost. It was not the kind of thing that made a good story at a distance. But up close, it was everything. 3 months after the wedding, Marin stood in the town hall again. The next time at a meeting she had called herself. She had spent the spring thinking about the flood. Not the damage which had been repaired, not the losses which had been absorbed, but the fact that it had been close, too close, that the families who had come to Hollister Ridge in the night had come because they had nowhere else to go, that the valley had no organized shelter, no emergency storehouse, no plan for what happened when the river rose and the roads went under and people were caught in the dark, with children and livestock, and nowhere to put them. She had thought about this, and she had done what she did with things she thought about, which was work out the numbers. She had presented the idea to Bram in May. A permanent storm shelter on neutral ground, high enough to stay clear of the worst flooding, with a storehouse attached. Not on Hollister Ridge, not on any single ranch, but on town-owned land at the center of the valley. Funded by contributions from the ranches and families of the area in proportion to what they could give. Bram had said how much. She had given him a number. He had said, "And you've already talked to Bill Henderson." She had said, "Bill thinks the Greer family might contribute if Aldous thinks the idea was partially his." Bram had looked at her. He had said, "You're going to let Aldous Greer think this was his idea." She had said, "I am going to allow the possibility to remain open." He had said, "That is the most Marin Whitlock thing you have ever said to me." She had said, "Thank you." Now she stood in the town hall in July and looked at the people who had come to the meeting, more than she'd expected, which meant the word had traveled well. The Deacons and the Hendersons and the Mallorys, who had been in the barn the night of the flood and carried that night in them, the way people carry the nights they were most frightened and most cared for, simultaneously. Margaret Greer, who had talked Aldous into attending, and Aldous himself in the third row, looking like a man who has decided to be supportive of something that has been very gently maneuvered around him. Several families she knew by name people from the far eastern part of the valley who had heard about the flood shelter through the particular communication network of rural places, which was slow but thorough. Roy Garrett was there. He sat in the back row with Calvin Hatch, and when Marin stood at the front of the room, he gave her the same nod he'd given her in the study, the one that meant what it meant without making a performance of it. She said, "Most of you were in the valley last October, when the alder came up. Quiet in the room," she said. "Some of you were in the barn at Hollister Ridge. Some of you were on roads that went under before you could get your families out. Some of you had water in your houses and nowhere to go and made decisions in the dark with incomplete information." She paused. "We were lucky. We had the ridge road, and we had the barn, and we had enough hands to keep things moving through the night. But luck is not a plan." She had notes. She had written them out the way she wrote everything, carefully and in order, but she found she didn't need them. She knew what she wanted to say. She said, I came to this valley 14 months ago with nothing. Less than nothing, 43 cents, and a sleeping daughter, and a carpetbag that was held together with twine. Someone opened a door for me when I needed it. She did not look at Bram, who was sitting in the front row. She did not need to. I have been thinking since October about what it means to have a door opened, about what it costs and what it gives. And I have been thinking that one door opened for one family in the dark is a beginning. But it is not a community. She looked at the room. She said, I want to build something permanent. A shelter on the high ground between the Henderson's land and the East Ridge. A storehouse with enough provisions to support 3 families through 2 weeks without resupply. A plan, actual written plan, for who does what when the water comes up next time. Because it will come up again. We all know that. She said, I am asking each family here tonight to consider what they can contribute. I am not here to tell you what that number is. I know what ranching costs, and I know what a bad year looks like, and I am not going to stand here and tell anyone that generosity is easy. She paused. I am going to tell you that last October, Doris Hatch put a cot in a cottage for a child she had never met, and that one cot in one cottage started everything that I now have. And what I have, I am here to give back. The room was quiet. Then Bill Henderson said from the 3rd row, how much for the structure? She gave the number. Bill said Henderson family is in for a third of it. Aldous Greer, who had clearly been waiting to see who moved first, said Greer Ranch will match that. Margaret Greer, beside him, put her hand on his arm in a way that suggested she had spent considerable effort getting him to that sentence and was not going to let him take it back. The rest of the room followed. Not all of them, not immediately. Some needed to talk to their wives. Some needed to do the arithmetic themselves before they committed. But by the end of the evening, there was enough. More than enough. There was a committee of 4 people, including Marin and Bill Henderson and Eleanor Deacon's husband Daniel, who turned out to have opinions about construction, and there was a date in September for the first materials to arrive. Marin walked home, not back to the ranch, home in the summer evening with Bram beside her and Nell between them, holding a hand on each side and swinging slightly in the way that children swing when they are happy and don't need a specific reason for it. Nell said, why did all those people clap for you? Marin said, we're going to build something. Together. Nell said, what kind of something? Marin said, a place for people when they need help, so they always have somewhere to go. Nell considered this. Then she said, like how we had somewhere to go. Marin looked at her daughter. The evening light was doing the particular thing it did at this time of year in Nebraska low and golden, making everything it touched look like something worth keeping. She said exactly like that. Nell seemed satisfied. She went back to swinging between them, her birthday boots scuffing the summer dust, and Marin felt Bram's hand shift slightly in her daughter's grip, steadying her when she swung too far. The way you steady someone without making them aware of being steadied. She did not say anything about it. She just felt it and filed it in the part of herself where she kept the things that were real and permanent, and hers. The storm shelter was built before the first snow of that winter. It was not elegant. It was a solid structure of good timber on the highest navigable ground between the Henderson land and the ridge, with a roof that was tested twice in its first season and did not leak, and a storehouse attached that held, by December, enough provisions for exactly what Marin had promised, 3 families, 2 weeks, no resupply needed. They dedicated it on a Saturday afternoon in November when the air was cold and clear and the whole valley seemed close under that particular winter sky. Most of the families who had been at the town hall meeting in July came, and some who hadn't but had heard. Someone put coffee in a large pot. Someone else brought a cake that was too large for the occasion and therefore exactly right. Nell, who had been put in charge of holding a ribbon that Marin had tied across the shelter door for the occasion, took this responsibility extremely seriously and stood with the ribbon for the better part of 40 minutes before anyone was ready to cut it. And when the moment finally came, she held it straight and taut with the focus of someone who understands that require your full attention. There were no grand speeches. Marin had specifically asked for no grand speeches because she found them, as a general rule, to be the point at which people started taking credit for things in ways that didn't fully account for who had actually done what. What she said, when people looked at her expectantly, was simple. She said, when the water comes up again, and it will, this is where you come. That was all. Roy Garrett, standing at the back of the gathered crowd with his hat in his hands, said, "Good place for it," which was, from Roy, practically an oration. Nell cut the ribbon with the kitchen scissors. Marin had brought in her coat pocket because someone had to have thought to bring scissors, and the shelter door opened, and the first people to walk in were the Deacon children, who immediately began investigating every corner with the thoroughness of children that the point of a new space is to completely explore it. Eleanor Deacon stood in the doorway watching them, said to Marin quietly, "Thank you for this." Marin said, "Thank everyone who contributed." Eleanor said, "I do. But this," she gestured at the structure, the storehouse, the whole deliberate solidness of it. "This started with you." Marin said, "It started with someone opening a door." Eleanor looked at her. She said, "Then it started with Bram." Marin said, "It started before that, too." She thought about a station master with a carpetbag and a train platform in October and the wind that had pushed at her back like it was trying to help. She thought about the way necessity could be a kind of teacher, brutal and effective, and what you kept from its lessons when you finally came out the other side. I think these things start a long time before we notice them starting. That winter was milder than the previous one. The ranch ran well. The new supply ordering held. The east pasture rotation worked as projected. The Henderson Creek access performed even better than Marin's revised numbers had suggested. Nell turned 7 in October with a new friend at her party, besides Clara Henderson, the daughter of one of the families from the east part of the valley who had started attending the same informal school that met twice a week in the town hall. She was loud and joyful and had very definite views about how birthday cake should be distributed. And Marin stood at the edge of the celebration and watched her daughter be 7 years old in a room full of people who knew her name. She thought, she will not remember the train. She is young enough that the train will not be a clear memory. She will grow up here, and this will simply be where she is from. That thought sat in her chest with a warmth that had no sharp edges in it. Bram found her at the edge of the party, standing with a cup of coffee, and the expression she sometimes had when she was thinking something she hadn't said yet. He stood beside her at Nell, who was currently in an active negotiation with Pete about whether he was allowed a second piece of cake before all the children had had a first. But he said, "She's something." Marin said, "She is." He said, "She told Roy yesterday that she wants to learn to read the accounts." Marin said, "She's 6. He's 7 as of today." Marin said, "She's 7 and she wants to learn the accounts." He said Roy's exact response was, and I'm quoting, "That's the Whitlock in her." She looked at him. He said, "Roy Garrett said that, out loud, to Calvin, with what I can only describe as approval." She looked back at Nell, who had won the cake negotiation and was handing Pete his piece with the magnanimity of someone who has been generous on her own terms. She said, "I want to teach her the accounts. Next year, when she's reading well enough, I want her to know all of it. The supply ordering, the cattle inventory, the contracts, everything." He said, "She'll run this place better than both of us by the time she's 20. Marin said, "That's the idea." He said, "Good idea." They stood at the window of the party, and their daughter, be 7, and outside the November wind was doing the thing it did, looking for gaps in things and finding none here. Years later, when people in Red Willow talked about Marin Hollister, and they did talk about her, the way communities talk about the people who changed the shape of their shared life, start the story where she might have expected them to start it. They did not start with the flood, though the flood had mattered. They did not start with the storm shelter, though the shelter had become the thing people pointed to when they described who she was. They started, most of them, with a particular detail that had been told and retold until it was part of the fabric of the valley in a way that facts become when they carry something true about a person. They said she came off the train in October with nothing, and a man opened a door for her, and she worked for everything she got, and when the water came up and everyone needed a door opened, she opened hers without hesitating, and that was simply who she was. She didn't do it because she was good in the way that people who've never been desperate can be good, comfortable, and untested. She did it because she had been on the side of a closed door, and she knew exactly what it weighed. That, people said, was the whole of it. And it was not the whole of it. No story told about a person ever is, Because the whole of any life is too large and too complicated and too private to fit into what other people carry of it. The whole of it included the 3 in the morning fear she'd carried for years and slowly set down. The ledger entries in her handwriting that had saved the ranch money nobody missed until it wasn't being lost. The biscuits on the first morning. The folded piece of paper about creek land that had started something larger than a land deal. The specific way Nell laughed at Pete's jokes. The warmth of a fire in a cottage that belonged to her. But the thing people said was also true, in the way that the parts of stories that get carried forward are always true. Not completely, but essentially, she had known what a closed door weighed, and she had never, not once, let that knowledge make her someone who kept hers shut. That was what she left in the valley. That was what stayed after everything else settled. Not the storm shelter, though the shelter stood. Not the accounts, though the accounts balanced. Not even the marriage, though the marriage was real and solid and built on the kind of honesty that makes things last. What states was simpler than any of that? It was the fact that a woman who had been turned her from every door she'd knocked on had spent the rest of her life making sure no one in her reach would have to sleep in the cold. And that had been enough. More than enough. It had been, in the end, everything.